Damien Osei did not cry at his own wedding. He stood at the altar in a charcoal suit that cost more than most people earned in a month, and he watched the doors at the end of the aisle open slowly, and he felt something he was not expecting. It was not love. It was not nerves. It was the quiet, certain feeling of a man who believed he had already won something before the game had fully begun. Nadia walked toward him alone. Her dress was white and simple, with no embroidery, no trail of fabric behind her, no jewelry, except a thin gold chain around her neck that had belonged to her mother. She had done her own hair. She carried a small bunch of white flowers that she had picked up from a market stall on the way to the church, because the florist her family had booked had canceled 2 days before without explanation, and there had been no money to find another one in time. She walked with her chin up and her eyes straight ahead, and there was something in her expression that Damien could not quite name. It was not happiness, exactly. It was more like resolve. His mother, seated in the front pew beside his uncle, leaned slightly to the side and said something low and quiet. Damien did not hear the words, but he saw his uncle nod. He would learn later what she had said. For now, he smiled at Nadia as she reached him, and she smiled back, and the pastor began to speak, and the ceremony moved forward the way ceremonies always do, with words that feel large in the moment and become ordinary very quickly once the day is over. Damien had grown up in a household where money was counted carefully, not because there was never enough, but because his father had made a religion out of caution. His father, a retired engineer named Charles Osei, had built his life one careful brick at a time. He had never bought anything he could not fully afford. He had never borrowed from friends or family. He had never allowed debt to touch the edges of his life, and he had passed that particular brand of pride down to his son, like a piece of furniture that cannot be thrown away, because it has been in the family too long. By the time Damien was 32 years old, he owned a consulting firm that employed 14 people. He had a house in a quiet suburb with a garden that he rarely sat in but liked knowing was there. He had a car that was reliable and expensive without being showy. He had savings, investments, and a reputation in his industry for being thorough, dependable, and slightly difficult to read. He was the kind of man people described as solid. He liked that word. He thought it suited him. He had met Nadia at a hospital fundraising event 3 years before the wedding. She was there as a volunteer, not a donor. She had been wearing a hospital lanyard over a plain blue dress, and she had been carrying a clipboard and directing people toward the buffet table, with the efficiency of someone who had been doing it for hours and was beginning to feel the tiredness in her feet. Damien had asked her where the drinks were, and she had pointed without looking up from her clipboard, and then she had looked up, and something shifted in the air between them, in the way that things sometimes do between strangers who are not yet strangers. He had asked for her number. She had paused for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then she had given it to him. He had called 3 days later, which he considered a reasonable interval, neither too eager nor too dismissive. They had met for coffee, and then dinner, and then several more dinners, and over the course of 18 months, they had built something that felt real and warm and like it could last. He knew Nadia was not wealthy. She had told him early that she had grown up in a family that struggled. Her mother had been ill for many years. Her father had left when she was young, and the word left carried a weight in the way she said it that made it clear he had not left on good terms or with any intention of returning. She had worked through her nursing degree with a combination of student loans and part-time shifts, and she had graduated with debt and determination in roughly equal measure. Damien had listened to all of this and felt something that he would have described as admiration. He told himself that he respected her for her resilience. He told himself that what she lacked in financial standing, she more than made up for in character. He told himself these things, and he believed them, and he also believed something else at the same time, the way people often hold two contradictory beliefs without noticing the contradiction. He believed that he was doing her a favor, not consciously, not in any way he would have said out loud, but the belief lived in him quietly, in the way he picked up every bill without discussion, in the way he planned their dates without asking her preference, in the way he talked about their future, as though it were a business plan he had already drafted, and she was being brought in to review. He had not proposed with any great romantic ceremony. He had asked her over dinner at a restaurant he had chosen, at a table he had reserved, with a ring he had selected alone. She had said yes, and she had looked at him with that expression again, the one he could not quite name, and he had taken her hand across the table and felt like a man who had made a very good decision. The preparations for the wedding revealed the difference between them in a way that Damien could not ignore. His side of the guest list was long and full of people who arrived in cars and wore expensive clothing and brought gifts that required a separate table to hold them all. Nadia's side was smaller and quieter. Her mother was there, frail but present, seated in a wheelchair that Nadia had arranged to rent for the occasion. Her uncle was there, a broad-shouldered man named Gerald who had a habit of arriving late and filling whatever room he entered with a presence that was difficult to define. There were cousins, a few friends from her nursing shifts, and 2 women from the community group her mother had attended before she became too unwell to leave the house regularly. There were no expensive gifts from Nadia's family. There was a handmade card that her mother had worked on for what must have been a long time, based on the careful detail in the lettering. There was a set of kitchen towels from a cousin who apologized when she handed them over, as though she knew they were not enough. There was a small envelope from Gerald that Damien found in the pile of cards later that evening and set aside without opening, assuming it contained cash that he neither needed nor was curious about. He did not open it until 2 days after the wedding, when they were already settled into the first quiet hours of their life together. Inside was a folded note and no cash. The note read, in Gerald's slightly uneven handwriting, "Take care of her. She has carried enough." Damien read it once, put it back in the envelope, and placed the envelope in the drawer of his desk, where it would remain, unthought of, for nearly 3 years. After the ceremony, there was a reception at a hall that Damien had booked and paid for. The food was good, the music was appropriate, and his mother moved through the room like a woman conducting an inspection. Her name was Frances Osei, and she was a woman who had a gift for saying things that were technically polite, but carried an edge that only the target could feel. She had met Nadia 4 times before the wedding, and had been, at each meeting, entirely pleasant, in a way that left Nadia slightly unsettled, without being able to say exactly why. At the reception, Frances found Nadia near the dessert table, and took her hand in both of hers, and said, "You look lovely, dear. So simple. I always think simple is underrated." Nadia had thanked her. Frances had patted her hand once, the way a person pats the head of a child who has said something sweet but slightly foolish, and moved on to speak with someone else. Damien's uncle, a man named Roland who had done well in property development and considered himself something of a life philosopher, found Damien near the bar and slapped him on the shoulder with more force than was necessary. "She's a good woman," Roland said. "Quiet, steady. That's what you want." He said this as though he were describing a piece of machinery that had tested well. Damien had nodded and accepted the compliment for what it was worth. By the end of the evening, when the last guests had gone, and Nadia was sitting on the edge of the hotel bed, still in her wedding dress, removing the pins from her hair, Damien looked at her and felt something genuine. She was beautiful, in a way that did not announce itself. She had a quality of stillness that he found restful, though he had never said so to her, because saying it felt like giving away something he preferred to keep. "You were quiet tonight," he said. She looked at him in the mirror. "It was a long day. You could have let people take care of things. You didn't have to keep checking on the catering." She turned from the mirror. Someone had to. He had thought she meant it as a general statement about the kind of person she was. He had not considered that she might mean it as something more specific. He had not considered, that night or in the days that followed, that there might be dimensions to her practicality that had nothing to do with personality, and everything to do with years of living in circumstances where no one else was coming to take care of things. They had left for their honeymoon the following morning. It was a trip to a coastal resort that Damien had planned and paid for. Nadia had packed a single medium-sized bag. He had packed 2 large ones. She had looked at his luggage and said nothing, and he had said, "I like to have options," and she had smiled in that particular way she had, the way that made him feel she was finding something gently amusing about him, though he could never tell exactly what. On the second evening of the trip, they sat on a balcony overlooking the water, and the sky was orange and pink, and there was a breeze that made the evening comfortable. Nadia had her feet tucked under her, and she was looking at the water with an expression that was hard to read. Damien was looking at her. "Are you happy?" he asked. She turned to look at him. "Yes," she said. "You seem far away." "I was thinking," she said. "About what?" She was quiet for a moment. "About how strange it is," she said, "to begin something new when you're still carrying something old." He had assumed she meant her mother's illness, or the general weight of leaving one chapter of life and entering another. He had not asked her to elaborate. He had reached across and taken her hand, and she had let him hold it, and they had sat there until the sky went dark, and he had thought that he understood her, and he had been wrong. The early weeks of their marriage had a particular kind of sweetness that neither of them had quite expected. Damien had lived alone for long enough that he had forgotten what it meant to share a space with another person, and Nadia surprised him. She was tidy, but not rigid. She cooked on the nights she was not working, and made meals that were simple and very good. She had opinions about things he had not thought to have opinions about, like which direction the sofa should face, and whether the overhead light in the kitchen was too harsh for evening meals. She said these things plainly and without apology, and he found that he respected that, even when it startled him. She was a good nurse. He knew this, not from watching her work, but from the way she was outside the hospital. She noticed things. She paid attention. When his uncle Roland mentioned at a family dinner that his knee had been bothering him for months, Nadia had asked 3 quiet questions that revealed, without making a scene of it, that the symptoms warranted a proper examination sooner rather than later. Roland had gone to see a doctor the following week, more at Nadia's gentle insistence than his own inclination, and the doctor had been glad he came. These small evidences of her competence and care accumulated in Damien's awareness, and he filed them under things that confirm I made a good choice, which was not the same as truly seeing them. He admired her, in the way that a person can admire something they do not fully understand. What he did not understand was her relationship with money. She never complained about what she had or didn't have. She never asked him to buy her things. She accepted what he provided for the household without comment, but she also maintained her own nursing income in her own account, and she spent it in ways he was not curious enough to track. He assumed she was saving, or spending on small personal things, or sending occasional amounts to help with her mother's needs. All of these seemed reasonable to him, and so he let the assumption sit undisturbed. His mother called on a Saturday morning, 6 weeks after the wedding, and Damien took the call in his study, while Nadia was in the garden. Frances spoke in the careful, measured way she used when she was saying something she had rehearsed. "I just want you to know," she said, "that I think you're very generous. The way you've taken care of everything, the wedding, the honeymoon, the house. You're a good son, Damien, and I think you'll be a good husband." She paused. "I just hope she appreciates it." "She does," he said, because it seemed like the right thing to say. "I'm sure she does," his mother said, in a tone that suggested she was not entirely sure at all. "She just seems like a woman who has never had to think about these things, which is fine. Some people are like that." Damien said nothing. "I only mean," his mother continued, "that she came into this marriage very light. Nothing to bring to it financially, no family connections of any real use, just herself." Another pause. "Which is enough, of course. For the right man. And you're that man." After the call ended, Damien sat at his desk for a few minutes, looking at nothing in particular. He heard Nadia come in through the back door, heard her fill a glass of water in the kitchen, heard her walk down the hall toward the living room. He thought about what his mother had said, and he thought about the envelope in his desk drawer, the one with Gerald's note inside. He did not open the drawer. He told himself his mother was wrong to see it the way she did. He told himself Nadia was more than her financial history. He believed both of these things. But the seed had been planted, and seeds do not need permission to grow. They only need time, and the right kind of silence, and the occasional quiet moment in which a person sits alone with their assumptions and does not think to question them. Damien had plenty of all 3. Outside, a neighbor's dog was barking at something. A car passed. Nadia turned on the television in the living room, and the sound of it reached him faintly through the wall, ordinary, and warm, and close. He got up from his desk and went to join her. She looked up when he came in, and she moved her feet to make room for him on the sofa, and she handed him the remote without being asked, and he sat down beside her, and did not think about the note in the drawer, or what his mother had said, or the expression on Nadia's face at their wedding that he still could not name. He would think about all of it later. He would think about very little else. But that evening, he sat on the sofa beside his wife, in the house he owned, and the television murmured, and the room was warm, and he felt like a man who had everything arranged the way he wanted it. He did not know yet how wrong he was about the arrangement. The first year of the marriage settled into a shape that looked, from the outside, like contentment. Damien went to his office 5 days a week, and sometimes 6. He came home to a house that was clean, to food that was ready, or almost ready, to a woman who asked about his day, and listened when he answered. He paid every bill, handled every account, and organized their financial life the way he organized everything else in his world, with precision, with control, and with the unspoken assumption that this was simply the correct order of things. Nadia left for her nursing shifts 3 or 4 times a week, and on her days at home she ran the household with the kind of quiet efficiency that Damien took for granted almost immediately. He noticed when things were done badly, or not done at all, but he rarely noticed when they were done well, because things done well have a way of becoming invisible. The house was always in order. The refrigerator was always stocked. The dry cleaning was always collected. He assumed these things happened because his wife had nothing more pressing to do, and he did not examine that assumption closely enough to see how much it revealed about him. What Nadia actually had, beyond the house and the shifts and the domestic rhythms of a marriage still finding its footing, was a weight. It was not a new weight. She had been carrying it for years before she ever met Damien, and she had become so practiced at carrying it that she had learned to move through her days without showing it. She smiled, she cooked, she was present. She was, by every visible measure, a woman who was managing her life well. She was also, in ways that were invisible to everyone who lived inside the comfort of not asking, managing a great deal more than anyone knew. Her mother's name was Dorothy, and Dorothy had been sick for a long time. The illness had started as something the family hoped was manageable, a condition the doctors said could be treated, and in the early years there had been a kind of cautious optimism in the household. But treatment cost money, and the money ran out before the illness did, and by the time Nadia was in her 2nd year of nursing school, the family had begun borrowing. Not from a bank. Banks have requirements, documentation, waiting periods, and a tendency to say no to people whose credit history looks like the record of a life lived under pressure. The family had borrowed from a lender that operated in the space between formal finance and the kind of arrangement that exists because formal finance has too many doors with too many locks. The man who had arranged the loan was not the lender himself but a middleman, and that middleman was Gerald, Nadia's uncle, the one who had stood at the back of the wedding with a presence that filled the room, the one who had sent the note with the careful handwriting, and the words that Damien had not thought about since the day he had put them in the drawer. Gerald had meant well, in the way that people who make large decisions on behalf of others sometimes mean well. He had seen his sister suffering, his niece struggling, the bills multiplying, and he had done what he could. What he could do, at that particular moment in their lives, was to call in a favor from a man he knew who could provide cash quickly and quietly. The terms of that loan were not generous. The interest rate would have been considered predatory by any financial regulator who looked at it, and the repayment expectations were enforced not through courts or collection agencies, but through a different kind of pressure, the kind that comes from knowing the person who is owed does not operate within systems that protect borrowers. Nadia had known about the loan from the beginning. She had not agreed to it, but she had not stopped it either, because she had been 20 years old and exhausted and watching her mother deteriorate, and the alternative to Gerald's arrangement was a set of outcomes she could not allow herself to consider. The money had paid for a treatment that bought her mother 2 more years of reasonable health, and Nadia had decided, in the private arithmetic of her conscience, that the debt was the price of those 2 years, and she would pay it. The problem with that arithmetic was that the debt did not stay still. By the time Nadia graduated and began earning a nursing salary, the original sum had grown substantially. She had started making payments immediately, every month, quietly and consistently, and the balance had decreased, but slowly, because the rate at which it was charged meant that each payment was covering more of the cost of the debt than the debt itself. She had never told anyone about this, not a colleague, not a friend, not any of the women she had grown close to during her training years. She had told herself that it was not a burden she should share, that she was managing it, that it would eventually be over. She had told herself these things in the same way that people tell themselves things they need to believe in order to keep moving forward, which is to say with enough conviction to function, but never with the full peace of someone who truly believes the problem is solved. When she met Damien, she had been making payments for 3 years. The balance was smaller than it had been, but still present, still demanding, still attached to her like something that had decided it belonged to her permanently. She had made a decision when she agreed to their first date, and again when she agreed to their second, and again when things became serious between them. The decision was always the same. She would not tell him. She had reasons. Some of them were practical. She did not know him well enough in the beginning, and by the time she knew him well enough, she was already in love with him. And love makes some conversations feel more dangerous than they actually are. She was also honest enough with herself, in her private moments, to recognize that there was another reason beneath the practical ones. She was afraid of what he would think, not afraid that he would leave, exactly, though that fear was present. Afraid of something more specific, that he would look at her differently, that the look she saw in his eyes, the warm, settled look of a man who had decided she was the right choice, would change into something cooler and more evaluating. That she would become, in his eyes, a problem rather than a person. She had seen how he looked at people who had made financial mistakes. He did not say cruel things. He was not a cruel man, but he had a way of describing financial disorder in others, friends, relatives, colleagues, that revealed his real feeling about it, which was not quite contempt, but was not far from it. He called it a lack of discipline. He said it with a tone that made discipline sound like the highest virtue, and its absence like a character defect. She had listened to these comments and filed them carefully away and decided that the debt was something she would carry alone. This was, she understood even as she made the decision, not entirely honest. But she also understood that honesty is complicated, when the truth could cost you more than the silence. And she told herself, every time the discomfort of the secret rose in her, that she was not hiding anything that belonged to him. The debt was hers. The payments were hers. She was the one handling it. He was not affected. She told herself this, and believed it, mostly. The first year passed, and then the second began. And within the second year, several things happened that shifted the texture of the marriage in ways that were subtle enough to miss if you were not paying close attention. The first was a promotion at the hospital. Nadia moved from a general ward to a specialist unit, which came with longer hours, more responsibility, and a salary increase. The increase was not large enough to be dramatic, but it was enough to accelerate her debt payments slightly, and she felt, for the first time in years, that the end of the debt was visible. Not close, but visible, the way a destination looks when you have been driving for a very long time, and the skyline finally appears on the horizon. The second thing was that Frances, Damien's mother, began to visit more regularly. Frances had a gift for being present in a way that made the room feel slightly smaller, and she was not, in these visits, unkind to Nadia. But she was watchful. She noticed things. She noticed that Nadia's clothing was never extravagant, though the household budget certainly allowed for it. She noticed that Nadia's phone was older than it should have been, given what her son earned. She noticed that Nadia did not redecorate the living room the way Frances would have done, given the resources available. And she noted all of these observations, not as evidence of modesty or practicality, but as evidence of something she could not quite name. An offness. A gap between where Nadia should be and where she actually seemed to be. She said some of these things to Damien, carefully, in the way she always said things, with just enough plausible warmth to make them difficult to object to directly. She said that she had noticed Nadia seemed to not spend much on herself. She said she hoped Nadia was not uncomfortable asking Damien for things. She said she thought it was important for a wife to feel free to use the resources of the household. She said all of this with a face full of concern, and Damien received it with the mild discomfort of a man who is being told something he is not sure he believes but cannot quite dismiss. He began, in small ways, to watch Nadia more closely. Not with suspicion, not yet, but with a particular kind of attention that is different from ordinary attention, because it is looking for something specific, even if the watcher is not sure what that something is. He noticed, one Saturday morning, that Nadia was at the kitchen table, with her laptop open and a pen in her hand, writing something on a small notepad. When he came in, she closed the laptop tab she had been looking at and turned to him with a smile. He had asked what she was doing. She had said she was checking her account. He had said he thought all the accounts were in order. She had said she meant her own account, her nursing salary account, the one she maintained separately. He had nodded and poured himself coffee and said nothing more about it. But the moment stayed with him, in the way that small moments sometimes stay, when something in the texture of them feels slightly uneven, without being anything you could point to clearly. The third thing that happened in the second year was that Nadia's mother grew worse. Dorothy's condition, which had been stable for several months, changed. The stability ended the way stability often ends in cases like hers. Not dramatically, but gradually, one small indicator at a time, until the indicators added up to something that could not be ignored. Dorothy needed more care. The community services that had been helping were no longer sufficient. A care facility was the option that made the most medical sense, and care facilities cost money. Nadia had gone to look at 3 of them on her own, on a day when Damien was traveling for a conference. She had visited each one, taken notes, asked the right questions. Her nursing training made her good at asking the right questions, and she had come home with a clear sense of what was needed and what it would cost. She had also come home knowing that the cost was not something she was going to ask Damien to cover. Not yet. Not before she had worked out whether it was something she could find another way to manage. Damien did not know she had visited the care facilities until she told him, 3 days later, over dinner. She told him about Dorothy's changed condition, about the visits, about the options. He listened. He was genuinely concerned. He had respect for Dorothy, and for the difficulty of what Nadia carried in that relationship, a mother she had been partly responsible for since she was barely more than a child herself. He told Nadia that they would work out the finances for the care facility together. He said we, with the confident ease of a man who has money, and is used to money, being the solution to problems. Nadia thanked him. She looked at her plate for a moment, before she looked back up at him. She said she would figure out the numbers and bring them to him. He said she didn't have to do that. She said she preferred to. He said all right, and they finished dinner, and the conversation moved on to other things. What Nadia was actually doing, when she said she would figure out the numbers, was calculating. She was calculating whether the cost of the care facility could be managed alongside the debt payments, whether there was any way to restructure what she was sending each month, without triggering consequences she was not equipped to manage. She was calculating in the way that people calculate when they have been doing private financial acrobatics for so long that it has become second nature. When the mental arithmetic of keeping multiple financial realities separate and functional has become as automatic as breathing. She worked out that if she took a small portion of the household grocery budget and moved it, quietly, back into her personal account, she could cover the gap. She was the one who managed the grocery shopping. She was the one who tracked those costs. Damien saw the summary number at the end of each month. He did not see the receipts. She felt a flicker of something uncomfortable when she made this decision. Not exactly guilt, but something adjacent to it. She was not deceiving him, she told herself. She was managing. There was a difference. She would tell herself that for longer than she expected. Meanwhile, Damien's professional life was expanding. His firm won 2 new contracts that required more of his attention than usual, and his schedule filled up with meetings and travel, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from doing too much physical work, but from spending too many hours inside your own professional ambition. He came home tired, and ate well, and slept, and went back to work. He was not absent from the marriage, exactly, but he was present, in the way that a busy person is present, physically there, but not fully attending. There were good evenings. There were dinners that were warm, and conversations that went late, times when Damien laughed in a way that made the tension in his face disappear, and Nadia felt the version of him she had fallen in love with, the man underneath the certainty, the one who was funnier, and more curious, and less guarded than the one he showed the world. She held on to those evenings. She kept them like things she could take out later and look at when the other parts of their life felt heavier. He began to talk, in the second year, about savings goals. Not in a pressuring way. He mentioned, casually, that he was thinking about expanding their investment portfolio. He mentioned the possibility of a holiday home in a few years. He mentioned that if they were thinking about starting a family, it made sense to have certain financial structures in place beforehand. He said all of this the way he said most things, as though the plans were already made, and she was being included in the announcement rather than the discussion. Nadia listened and asked appropriate questions and gave appropriate answers and felt, each time, the particular unease of a person who is sitting inside a plan that does not account for the full truth of their situation. She was not lying to him, she told herself again. She was not spending his money on the debt. She was managing her own money, in her own account, to deal with something that was hers to deal with. She told herself this, with a firmness that was almost convincing. But in the middle of the second year, something changed in the debt itself. The man at the end of the payment chain, the one whose name she knew but had never met, changed the terms. Not dramatically, just a letter, delivered to the address that only Gerald knew, the address of Gerald's own home, so that nothing would arrive at Nadia's front door to cause questions. Gerald had brought the letter to her in person, sitting across from her in a coffee shop on a Tuesday afternoon when Damien was at the office. Gerald had put the letter on the table and had not said much. He was not a man who explained himself at length. The letter said that the interest rate was being adjusted. It gave a new monthly minimum. It was higher than the previous one, not dramatically, not enough to be catastrophic on its own, but enough to close the small gap between manageable and stretched that Nadia had been carefully maintaining. She had folded the letter and put it in her bag and finished her coffee. Gerald had watched her. He had the look of a man who felt responsible and could not figure out what to do with that feeling. "I'm handling it," she said. "I know," he said. "You should have told me more clearly what the terms were," she said. "I know," he said again. She had not been angry at him. She had been past anger about this particular situation for a long time. She was in the territory that lies on the other side of anger, the territory where the situation is simply a fact of your life, like weather or distance, something that does not improve when you feel badly about it. She had walked home from the coffee shop because the day was dry, and she needed to think, and thinking was easier when she was moving. She had walked through streets that were ordinary and busy and full of people going about the ordinary business of their days, and she had worked out, by the time she reached her own front door, how she was going to adjust her monthly calculations to accommodate the new minimum. It was tight. It was very tight, but it was not impossible. She had unlocked the door and gone inside and started preparing dinner, and when Damien came home she had kissed him on the cheek and asked how his day had been, and he had said fine, and she had said good, and neither of them had spoken about the things that lived in the space between them, because as far as Damien knew, there was nothing in that space. He thought he was standing in an open room. He did not know yet that there were walls. And so the second year of their marriage continued to look, from the outside, like a life arranged the way Damien had always intended to arrange things. Organized, stable, moving forward in a direction he had chosen. He paid the bills and made the plans, and sat across the dinner table from a woman who looked at him with something he could not quite read. And he took it for contentment, and he went on believing that he understood what he had built. He did not know that what he had built was sitting on ground that included territory he had never surveyed. He did not know that the woman across the table from him had been doing something extraordinary for years, quietly and without acknowledgement, something that required a precision and a courage and a discipline that would have surprised him, had he been paying the right kind of attention. He did not know, and she did not tell him, and the marriage moved forward on two tracks that ran parallel to each other, close enough to look like one road from a distance, but separate in ways that mattered. And the debt did not disappear. It waited, the way that certain kinds of truth always wait, patiently, without judgment, knowing that the moment will eventually come when there is no more room to step around it. Dorothy died on a Thursday morning in early spring. She had been in the care facility for 7 months by then. It was a clean and reasonably kind place, and the staff knew her name and talked to her gently. And in the weeks when she was still well enough to be aware of her surroundings, she had told Nadia that she was comfortable, that she was not afraid. She had said it with the particular calm of a woman who has made peace with a situation she cannot change, and Nadia had sat beside her bed and held her hand and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying. When the call came on that Thursday morning, Nadia was at work. She had just finished a shift assessment and was standing near the nurse's station with a coffee that had gone cold. Her phone vibrated. She looked at the screen and saw the number of the care facility, and she knew before she answered what the conversation would contain. She stepped outside into the corridor, answered, listened, said thank you to the person on the other end, and hung up. Then she stood in the corridor for exactly 1 minute, alone, not crying, not moving, just being in the moment the way a person is in the moment, before everything changes, and they have to decide how to carry the change. She called Damien. He answered on the second ring, which told her he was not in a meeting. "My mother passed," she said. There was a pause. "Nadia," he said, and his voice was different, softer, and direct, in a way he did not always manage. "I'm coming." He came. He picked her up from the hospital and drove her to the care facility so she could be with her mother before the arrangements began, and he sat in the waiting room while she went in alone, and when she came out, he did not ask questions. He drove her home. He made tea that she did not drink but held in both hands because the cup was warm. He called his assistant and rearranged the day. He was, in the hours that followed Dorothy's death, genuinely good to her, and she was aware of it, and it made the thing she was hiding feel heavier, not lighter, because kindness has a way of making secrets more uncomfortable than coldness does. The funeral was held 10 days later. It was a small service at a church that Dorothy had attended for most of her adult life, and the people who came were the people who had known Dorothy through the years of her illness, the neighbors and congregation members and community volunteers, who had shown up in various ways when Dorothy had needed them. Gerald came. He sat near the back and did not speak much to anyone. He looked at Nadia during the service with an expression she recognized, the expression of a person who is sorry for more things than they can list. Damien stood beside Nadia throughout. He held her arm during the burial. He thanked people who came to offer condolences with the confident social ease that he had always possessed, the ability to say the right things in public without requiring them to cost him anything emotionally. Nadia watched him do this and felt a complicated mixture of gratitude and loneliness, which is not an unusual combination of feelings in a marriage, but which felt, in that particular moment, more pointed than usual. After the gathering at the house, when the last visitors had gone, and Damien had washed up the glasses and stacked the chairs that had been borrowed from next door, he found Nadia sitting in the garden. The evening was cold. She had a blanket over her shoulders, but she was still shivering slightly. Not from cold, she told him, when he pointed it out, just from being outside, just from needing the open air. He sat down beside her. "How are you doing?" he said. "I'm all right," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to be," he said. She turned to look at him. Sometimes he surprised her. This was one of those times. She put her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the garden in the cold until the dark got heavier, and they went inside. She did not cry until she was in the shower, with the water running and the bathroom door closed. She cried for her mother, and she cried for the years that had been too hard, and she cried for the particular exhaustion of being the kind of person who handles things. She did not cry about the debt, because the debt had stopped being something she could cry about. It had become simply a condition of her life, as permanent and unromantic as the mortgage on the house, except that no one knew about it, and it had not bought them anything they could walk through and touch. In the weeks after Dorothy's death, something loosened slightly in Nadia's internal world. It was not happiness. It was closer to a kind of space. The grief was real, and she felt it every day. But alongside the grief was something she had not expected, the absence of the particular anxiety that had surrounded her mother's care for so long. Dorothy was not suffering anymore. The decisions about her comfort and her treatment and her daily needs were no longer a source of quiet, constant calculation. That particular weight was gone. What remained was the debt, and the debt, now that the care facility costs had ended, was the only remaining financial crisis she was managing in secret. This should have made things simpler. In many ways it did. She was able to recalculate her monthly commitments and find that she had a little more room than she had had in the previous year, and she increased her monthly debt payment by an amount that was not dramatic, but was consistent. And she told herself that this was the right direction, and she was moving in it, and in time it would be over. But grief does something to a person's relationship with time. It makes some things feel more urgent and other things feel impossibly distant. In the months after Dorothy's death, Nadia found herself thinking about the debt differently than she had before, not thinking about it more. She had always thought about it a great deal, but thinking about it with a different quality. The secret she was keeping felt, for the first time, not just practically complicated, but morally uncomfortable, in a way she had not previously allowed herself to feel. She was sitting with Damien one evening, watching something on television, when he made a comment about a colleague whose personal finances had become entangled with business decisions in ways that were problematic. The colleague had borrowed from a private source to invest in a venture that had not worked out, and now the private source was applying pressure, and the colleague's professional reputation was suffering because the connection had become known. "It's the secrecy that kills you," Damien said. not harshly, just observationally, the way he talked about other people's situations, from a position of confident hindsight. If he had just been upfront about what he'd done from the start, he could have managed it. The moment you start hiding a financial problem, you're guaranteeing it becomes a bigger problem. Nadia had kept her eyes on the television. Not always, she said. He turned to look at her. What do you mean? I mean, sometimes people hide things because they have to, not because they're foolish. He considered that, I suppose, but hiding it still doesn't help. She had not said anything more. The conversation had moved on. She lay in bed that night and stared at the ceiling and thought about what he had said and about the fact that she had been hiding her situation, not because she was foolish, which she knew she was not, but because she had looked at the man she was about to marry and calculated, correctly or not, that the truth would cost her something she was not willing to pay. She thought about whether that was cowardice or pragmatism, and she was not sure she could tell the difference anymore. In the 3rd year of their marriage, Damien's firm expanded. He hired 3 more people, took on a larger office, and repositioned the company in a direction that required more capital investment. He was not reckless about it. He was never reckless. But the expansion meant that he was spending more time monitoring the firm's finances, and this increased attention to money bled into his domestic life in ways that were subtle but present. He began doing monthly reviews of the household accounts. This was not new. He had always been organized about their finances, but the reviews became more systematic. He started using a new app that tracked every expense across every account linked to the household. He connected his own accounts, the joint household account, the bills accounts, the investment accounts. He mentioned to Nadia that he had set up the tracking system and that she could access it any time if she wanted to see where things stood. He did not ask her to connect her own nursing salary account to the system. It did not occur to him to ask, because in his mental model of their finances, her account was a personal spending account that she managed for her own expenses, and the amount she earned from nursing was supplementary, meaningful, he would have said if pressed, but not central to the picture. He had never sat down and calculated what would happen to their household finances if her income disappeared. He had not thought about it that way. He earned enough that the idea of her income as a structural necessity had never fully formed in his mind. This was, Nadia had understood from the beginning of their relationship, one of the foundational inequalities between them. Not because he was unkind about it, but because he had simply never needed to think about money the way she had always thought about it. When you have always had enough, money is a tool. When you have not always had enough, money is a landscape, and you learn to read it the way a traveler learns to read terrain. Nadia read money like someone who had been navigating it in difficult weather for years. Damien read money like someone who had always had a reliable map. It was also, she recognized, why she had been able to maintain her secret for as long as she had. She knew the numbers. She understood accounts and margins and the way debt compounds. She managed her own financial life with the competence of someone who had been trained by necessity. And she managed it without leaving traces that were obvious enough to require explanation. In the 3rd year, the contact with the lender changed character. The letters had always gone to Gerald's address, but in the 3rd year, a new person appeared in the chain. Not the original lender, whose name Nadia had never been given directly, but an intermediary, a man who called himself Adrian, which may or may not have been his actual name, and who called Gerald's number every quarter to confirm that the payments were continuing. Gerald relayed these calls to Nadia, and she confirmed that yes, the payments were continuing, they were always continuing, she had never missed one. But Adrian, in the autumn of the 3rd year, said something that was different from anything that had been said before. He said that the lender had decided to sell the debt to another party, which was a common enough financial transaction in the world of informal lending, except that in this case, the other party had different requirements. They wanted the remaining balance cleared within 18 months, rather than continuing on the extended payment schedule that had been in place. When Gerald told her this, Nadia sat with the information for 3 days before she did anything with it. She was a person who processed things privately and thoroughly before acting, which had served her well in many situations. She calculated the numbers. The remaining balance, divided over 18 months, came to a monthly payment that was nearly 3 times what she was currently managing. She could not cover that with her nursing salary, while also meeting her contributions to the household and maintaining the grocery account management she had been doing. She could ask Damien for help. She sat with that possibility the way you sit with something that frightens you, carefully, at a distance, trying to understand its dimensions before you move closer. Asking Damien for help would mean telling him. Telling him would mean everything. The origin of the debt, the years of secrecy, the small financial adjustments she had made within the household, the uncle's arrangement, all of it. She thought about his face when he spoke about his colleagues' hidden financial problems. She thought about the way he had said, "The secrecy is what kills you," with the easy confidence of a man who had never been in a position where secrecy felt like the only viable option. She also thought, and this was the thought that sat most heavily, about what it would cost her to ask. Not financially. Relationally. She thought about what it would mean to stand in front of Damien and tell him the truth, and she tried to picture his expression in that moment, and what she pictured was not cruelty, because he was not a cruel man, but something she found harder to bear than cruelty. She pictured the shift, the recalibration, the moment when his image of her, the woman he had married, the woman who had come with empty hands but who had been steady and capable and present, would change into something more complicated, something that required him to revise the story he had told himself about their marriage. She did not want to do that to him. She also, if she was fully honest with herself, did not want to do it to herself. She did not want to watch him decide, in the moment of revelation, whether she was still the person he had thought she was. She had spent years managing the secret precisely so that the question would never arise, so that she would never have to be on the receiving end of that particular evaluation. She called Gerald instead. Gerald answered on the third ring, and she told him about the new requirement, and there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "I'll see what I can do," he said. "What does that mean?" "It means I'll talk to the people involved and see if there's any flexibility." "There isn't going to be flexibility," she said. "You know that. That's not how this works." Another silence. "Nadia," he said, "I'm sorry. I have been sorry for a long time about this." "I know," she said. And she did know. Gerald's guilt was genuine, and it was consistent, and it was also, at this point, largely useless. Genuine regret does not reduce a balance. She thanked him, because that was the kind of person she was, and she hung up, and she sat in the car. She had taken the call in the car, parked outside a supermarket, because she had needed somewhere private, and she looked out at the ordinary afternoon outside the window. She had 18 months. In those 18 months, she needed to find a way to come up with a sum of money that she could not generate on her own, at the required rate. She had options. None of them were good. She could take out a loan from a legitimate lender in her own name, consolidate the informal debt into something formal and manageable, though the credit implications would be visible in her personal accounts and would require explanations she was not prepared to give. She could ask Gerald to help, but Gerald was not in a position to provide significant funds without his own difficulties. She could ask Damien, or she could continue, somehow, to manage it alone, finding cuts and adjustments and small efficiencies, and see how far that took her before the situation resolved itself or collapsed. She chose to continue, because the other choices required conversations she was not ready to have, and because she had been managing the impossible for long enough that it had begun to feel like something she was simply built to do. She started the car and drove to the supermarket and did the grocery shopping and drove home and made dinner. And Damien came home and kissed her cheek and said the house smelled good. And they ate together at the table, and she answered his questions about her day and he answered hers. And the evening passed the way evenings do, in a marriage that is functioning on the surface, and below the surface, something was pulling tighter and tighter, the way a rope does when the weight on it is more than it was designed to carry. She would not be able to hold it this way much longer. She did not know yet exactly what would give first, but she was beginning to understand that the 18 months was not just a deadline on the debt, it was a deadline on something else as well, a deadline on the version of herself she had been maintaining, and on the version of their marriage that existed in the space between what was real and what Damien believed. The rope was holding, but she could feel it in her hands every day now. And some evenings, when the house was quiet and Damien was asleep beside her, and the dark was full and still, she could hear it. 3 years and 4 months into their marriage, a letter arrived. Not at Gerald's address this time, at theirs. Nadia was the one who collected the post that morning, as she almost always was, because she left for her shift before Damien finished breakfast, and she passed the letterbox on her way to the car. She flipped through the usual things, a utility statement, a catalog that neither of them had requested, something from the bank addressed to Damien, and then she stopped. There was an envelope with her name on it, and no return address, and the handwriting on the front was unfamiliar, small, and pressed hard into the paper, as though whoever had written it had wanted to make sure it could not be confused with anything ordinary. She did not open it at the letterbox. She put it in her bag and drove to the hospital and sat in the car park for 8 minutes before she pulled it out. Inside was a single page. It told her that the debt had changed hands again. The new holder had different methods of communication. They preferred to write directly to the address they had for her, which they had obtained through a contact that she was to consider a mutual acquaintance. They outlined the new payment terms, which were not substantially different from what Adrian had communicated, except that the timeline had been shortened from 18 months to 12. At the bottom, in the same small, pressed handwriting, "We trust this arrangement will continue without interruption." She folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, and put the envelope in the inside pocket of her bag. Then she got out of the car and went to work, because there was nothing else she could do. She had a ward full of patients who needed her attention, and the debt was still going to exist in 12 hours, and she had learned long ago that panic was not a strategy. But she was afraid. Not of the new timeline alone, though that was serious enough. She was afraid of the letter itself. The letter had come to the house. Damien had not seen it. She had been the one at the letterbox. But the infrastructure of her secret had shifted. For 3 years, nothing had touched their front door. The arrangement with Gerald's address had held. Now someone new had her home address and had chosen to use it, and that meant that the line between the secret and the rest of her life had been crossed. The next letter might arrive on a day when Damien collected the post. The next contact might take a different form. She could no longer be certain that the secret was contained. She got through the shift on routine and professionalism, both of which she had in abundance. She checked on her patients. She communicated clearly with the doctors on her ward. She managed a difficult situation in the afternoon with a family who was frightened and needed someone to explain things calmly and repeatedly, and she did that well, the way she always did, because caring for people who were frightened was something she had been trained for in more ways than one. On her way home, she called Gerald. He did not answer. She left a message asking him to call her back as soon as he could, keeping her voice level, not saying in the message what the call was about, because she had learned to be careful about what she said to anyone who might be tangentially connected to any of this. Gerald called back that evening, when she was in the garden and Damien was inside watching the news. She told him about the letter. She told him about the new timeline and the home address. Gerald was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "This is getting out of hand, Nadia." "I know that," she said. "These people don't play around when they don't hear from you. I have never missed a payment, not once in 3 years. I know you haven't. But the debt has moved around, and when a debt moves, the new holder sometimes wants to establish that they're in control. It's a message. I understand what it is," she said. "What I need to understand is whether they're going to contact the house again." Gerald was quiet again, and the length of the pause told her something she did not want to know. "I can't guarantee that," he said. "The people I dealt with originally, I had some understanding with them. These new people, I don't have the same relationship." She had ended the call and sat in the garden for a while. The evening air was cool and still, and above her, the sky was shifting from pale blue to the darker color that comes just before night. She thought about the fact that she had been managing this for 3 years and had done so without incident, without discovery, without the situation leaking into the rest of her life. And now, because the debt had been sold twice in quick succession to parties she had no connection to, the structure she had built around the secret was beginning to develop cracks. She went back inside and sat with Damien while he finished watching the news, and when he turned to her and asked how her day had been, she said it had been a long one. He nodded. He was tired himself. He had been in back-to-back meetings for most of the day, and his patience for additional complexity was visibly low. She saw this in the way he held his shoulders and in the flatness behind his eyes that arrived when he was running close to empty. She did not tell him about the letter. She thought about it, sitting beside him on the sofa. She thought about the sentence that would start that conversation, and she rehearsed it in her mind. "There's something I need to tell you." And she felt the weight of what would follow that sentence, the full weight of it, all 3 years, and the years before that, and she could not make herself begin. Not tonight. she told herself. Not when he looks like that. Not when she didn't have a plan yet. Not when she still thought she might be able to find another way. She told herself these things, and went to bed, and did not sleep well, and got up the next morning, and went back to work, and the letter stayed in the inside pocket of her bag, like a coal that was too hot to hold, and impossible to put down. The weeks that followed were the most pressured she had known. She did not change her behavior in any way that was visible. She went to work. She came home. She managed the household. She sat across from her husband at dinner, and contributed to conversations about things that had nothing to do with the interior of her life. She was a person who had always compartmentalized well, who had always been able to keep the various rooms of herself separate and functional. She used that ability now, with a rigorous precision, that left her tired, in a way that sleep did not fully fix. She was also calculating. Every spare moment, during commutes, during breaks at the hospital, during the quiet hour after Damien went to sleep, she was running numbers. She was looking for any combination of legal, manageable, and invisible that could get her to a position where the 12-month timeline could be met. She looked at her salary. She looked at her monthly outgoings. She looked at whether a personal loan was viable without Damien finding out, which was complicated, because anything that touched their joint financial profile would show up on the app he used to track the household accounts. She looked at whether there was any overtime available at the hospital, and there was some, and she took every shift that was offered, telling Damien that the ward was short-staffed, which was also partly true. The extra shifts gave her something to do with the anxiety, and they gave her a small additional increment of income, and they gave her very little additional time in which to feel anything, except focused. She was grateful for that. Damien noticed the extra shifts. He mentioned them twice. The first time, he said he thought she was working too hard and she should take a break. She said the ward was genuinely short of people, and she didn't feel right leaving her colleagues to manage alone. He accepted this. He had always had respect for her professional commitment, even when he did not quite understand why she found the work as meaningful as she did. The second time, about 3 weeks later, he sat down across from her at the breakfast table, on a morning when she was getting ready for an early shift, and he looked at her, with the direct attention that he usually reserved for business situations, and he said, "Are you all right?" She looked at him over her coffee. "Yes," she said. "Why? You seem distant," he said, "even when you're here." She put the coffee cup down. She looked at her husband, and she felt something that moved through her like a current of water. The desire to tell him, simple and immediate and strong, and then, just as fast, the fear that had always followed that desire, and always won. "I'm tired," she said. "I've been doing a lot of shifts, and my mother's been gone less than 6 months. I think I'm still processing." He nodded slowly. She could not tell whether he fully accepted this, or whether something in him was still paying the kind of attention that does not let go. "Okay," he said, "but you can talk to me, Nadia, whatever it is." She smiled at him. It was a real smile, not a performed one, because she genuinely loved him, and the offer was genuine, and it cost her something to not take it. "I know," she said, "thank you." She left for her shift, and in the car, she sat for a moment, before starting the engine, and she thought about the word, whatever it is. He had said it openly, without conditions. He did not know that the whatever was substantial, and had been building for years, and had recently moved from manageable to urgent. He thought he was offering an open door for minor difficulties. He did not know he was standing next to a door that had been locked for 3 years. She started the car and drove to the hospital. Meanwhile, in the world of the firm, Damien was dealing with his own pressure. The expansion had created new complexity in the company's financial management, and he had recently hired an accountant, a precise and efficient man named Stuart, to work alongside the existing team. Stuart had an eye for patterns and inconsistencies that Damien found invaluable, and Stuart had quickly become a trusted figure in the firm's day-to-day operations. It was Stuart who first mentioned, casually, over a review meeting, that the firm's expenses had been running slightly higher than projected in the previous quarter. He went through the items carefully, the way Stuart did everything, methodically, without drama, with a quiet confidence that numbers had told him a story and he was simply relaying it. The discrepancy was not alarming, but it was worth examining. Damien agreed, and they scheduled a more detailed review. This review of the firm's finances, which had nothing to do with the household and nothing to do with Nadia, nevertheless planted something in Damien's mind. A small, precise attention to the way money moves. An alertness to patterns. It was occupational. It was professional. He did not carry it home consciously, but it settled into the way he looked at things. The way a habit of observation from one context can quietly expand into others without being deliberate about it. He began looking at the household accounts with slightly more attention than usual. Not with suspicion, not with anything he could have named, just with the reflexive thoroughness of a man whose professional life had recently required him to look more closely at numbers, and who brought that habit home, the way people bring work habits home, without knowing they have done it. He noticed, in a review he did on a Sunday afternoon while Nadia was at a shift, that the grocery expenditure over the previous 6 months was slightly lower than it had been in the previous 6 months, even though prices in general had risen. He assumed this meant Nadia had found better deals or changed where she shopped, and he noted it as a small positive and moved on. He did not think about it again for several weeks. He also noticed, during another review, that the pattern of Nadia's overtime payments into the household account had changed. For most of their marriage, her extra income had gone into her personal account, which was what they had agreed. But recently, very recently, some of it was coming into the joint account in small amounts, at irregular intervals. He assumed she was making a gesture toward the household, during a period when the firm's expansion had his personal contributions less predictable. He found this touching. He thought about mentioning it to her, and decided not to, in case it made her self-conscious. He filed it as evidence that she was a thoughtful person. He did not think to ask why the pattern had changed. He did not ask because he was not, yet, looking for anything. He was a man who did not tend toward suspicion in his personal life, partly because he trusted Nadia, and partly because his model of their marriage did not include spaces where things could be hidden. He thought he knew what he had built, and he thought he knew what it contained. This was the quality of his attention in the months before everything shifted. Observant, but not searching. Thorough, but not skeptical. The attention of a man who believes he has arranged things correctly, and is simply confirming that the arrangement is holding. The arrangement was not holding, though. Not in the way he thought. Nadia was making adjustments that were becoming harder to maintain. The 12-month timeline was running. 7 months remained. The amount she needed to clear was still more than she could generate at her current rate of acceleration. She had begun, quietly, to look at other options. She had looked at a credit union that served healthcare workers and had worked out that a loan through them was technically feasible if her credit history supported it, which she believed it did. She was trying to preserve this as a last option because it would require documentation that could end up somewhere Damien might see, and she was still operating on the principle that she wanted to handle this without involving him. But it was becoming clear, with every week that passed, that the window for handling it without involving him was narrowing. She was running calculations every day that she did not share with anyone. She was carrying a level of stress that showed up physically, in the tightness in her shoulders, in the quality of her sleep, in a tendency to become very still when she was in conversation, and suddenly needed to redirect her mind from the problem running beneath the surface to the person in front of her. Damien noticed the stillness. He noticed it the way you notice a sound that is not quite right in a room you know well, not immediately, not with alarm, but with a background awareness that files itself away for later. He did not ask about it directly. He was not the kind of man who asked direct questions about emotional states. He was the kind of man who waited for information to reach him, operating on the assumption that if something were truly important, it would eventually be said. The information was approaching. It was moving toward him the way a tide moves toward a shore, gradually, inevitably, with a force that had nothing to do with whether the shore was ready to receive it. Nadia did not know exactly how it would arrive. She only knew that the options she had were narrowing, that the people she owed were no longer distant, that a letter had come to the house, and might come again, and that the life she had been managing in 2 separate registers for 3 years was pressing toward a point where the registers could no longer be kept apart. On a Wednesday evening, in the 4th month before the deadline, Nadia sat in the bathroom of their house, with the door locked and her phone in her hands, and the number of the credit union on the screen, and she stayed there for 11 minutes, thinking about whether to make the call that would begin the process of borrowing money she could use to close the debt. She did not make the call. She put the phone in the pocket of her robe and unlocked the bathroom door, and went to the kitchen, and made 2 cups of tea, and brought them to the living room where Damien was reading, and she sat beside him and handed him his cup, and he looked up from his book and said thank you, in the distracted way of a person not yet ready to leave what they are reading. She watched the side of his face as he read. She knew this face. She had been looking at it for nearly 4 years, and she knew its expressions and its habits, and the way it changed when he was tired, or pleased, or thinking hard about something. She knew what it looked like when he was genuinely happy. She knew what it looked like when he was presenting happiness to a room, rather than actually feeling it. She also knew, with a clarity that had been forming for a long time, and had recently sharpened into something she could not ignore, that she was going to have to tell him. Not today, not this evening, but soon. The weight of what she was carrying had reached a point that one person could not continue to carry it without it becoming visible to everyone in the room, and Damien was in the room. She did not know how he would react. She had imagined it many times, and arrived at many different versions of his response. What she knew was that the not telling was becoming more expensive than the telling, and Nadia, whatever else she was a woman who understood the cost of things. She held her tea and watched him read, and she thought about beginnings, about how hard it is to begin a sentence you have been avoiding for years, and about how there comes a point at which the avoidance is no longer a choice you are making, but a direction you have simply been traveling, and you have to decide whether you turn around or keep going until you run out of road. She was nearly out of road. It was a Tuesday when Damien found the second letter. Nadia had left for an early shift before 7 in the morning, and the post came at past, and Damien was in the hallway putting on his jacket when the letterbox opened and a small collection of envelopes fell onto the mat. He picked them up. He moved through them with the automatic efficiency of a man who has sorted post all his adult life. A bank statement, a magazine for the community club he had joined and rarely visited, something addressed to Occupier, which he put directly into the recycling. And then an envelope addressed to Nadia, by hand, with no return address, and the same pressed, deliberate handwriting he would not have recognized because he had never seen it before. He held it for a moment. He was not the kind of man who opened his wife's correspondence. He had never done that, not in 4 years of marriage, not once. He put the envelope on the hallway table, with the other post, and finished putting on his jacket, and left for the office. But he thought about it during the drive. He thought about it during the first hour at his desk, when he was supposed to be reading a proposal from a potential new client. He thought about it in the particular way that small, unexplained things persist in the mind of a person who is used to having explanations for things, stubbornly, with a low background heat, refusing to be moved along. He had noticed, over the previous weeks, that something was different about Nadia. He had told himself it was grief, or tiredness, or the combination of both, that 4 years of marriage had taught him she rarely admitted to directly. He had told himself that she was managing. She always managed, and that if there were something he needed to know, she would tell him when she was ready. He had also noticed, just recently, that she had been to the letterbox herself on several recent mornings. He had not thought of this as significant. People collected their own post. He had not thought of it as a pattern. Now he thought about it as a pattern. He left the office at lunchtime, which was unusual for him. He told his assistant he was working from home for the afternoon. He drove home and walked into the empty house and stood in the hallway and looked at the envelope on the table. He did not open it. He stood there for 5 minutes, having a conversation with himself that he would not have been comfortable having out loud. He was a man who did not like uncertainty. He was a man who was used to having the full picture of the things that mattered to him, and he was aware, standing in his own hallway in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, that he did not have the full picture of something. He went into his study instead. He sat down at his desk. He opened the household finance app on his computer, which he did routinely, and without any specific target, because it was simply where he went when he wanted to think through numbers. He looked at the last 6 months of figures the way he would have looked at the accounts of a new client, without assumptions, with the intention of letting the pattern tell him what it wanted to say. He looked at the household grocery expenditure. He looked at the way certain line items had been adjusted over the previous year. He looked at the amounts that came from Nadia's nursing salary into the joint account, and at the amounts that went into her personal account, and at the timing of both. He was not looking for something specific. He did not have a theory he was trying to confirm. He was simply doing what he did with numbers when something felt slightly off. He read them the way other people might read a face. He spent 40 minutes doing this. At the end of 40 minutes, he had a set of observations that individually meant nothing and collectively formed a shape he could not name, but also could not dismiss. The grocery line had been quietly managed in a way that freed up small amounts each month. The pattern of Nadia's personal account contributions had changed over the last year. The timing of extra shifts correlated with specific months in a way that was consistent enough to be intentional rather than random. None of it pointed clearly to anything. He was not a person who leapt to conclusions. He sat with what he had found and let it rest for a moment. And then he closed the app and went to make coffee. And while the coffee was brewing, he stood in the kitchen and thought about the envelope on the hall table. He thought about his wife. He thought about the woman who had arrived at their wedding with simple flowers from a market stall. He thought about the way she moved through their house, competent and quiet, managing the domestic side of their life with a consistency that he was beginning to understand, never properly examined. He had credited it to her personality, her steadiness, her practicality. He had not asked himself what was behind the practicality. He had not asked himself what a person who had always had to take care of things looked like versus a person who simply chose to. He brought his coffee back to the study. He sat down again. He opened a different part of the finance app, the section that showed Nadia's personal account summary, which was connected to the app because all their individual accounts were linked through the same banking group. He had access to this data. He had never specifically reviewed it before. He had looked at overall numbers, summary lines, the household picture. He had not looked at her individual transactions. He looked at them now. He saw her salary deposits. He saw regular outgoing transfers, each month, consistent in timing, varying in amount, but within a similar range. The transfers went to an account number he did not recognize, not one of their accounts, not any account he had seen before in their financial records. He looked at the account number for a while. He could call the bank. He had the login credentials for the family account. He could, technically, investigate further. He did not do this. He was aware, as he sat there, of a line between the reasonable review of a household's finances and something that was less reasonable, less respectful, less like what he wanted to be as a husband. He closed the app. He sat with the coffee going cold on his desk, and the house very quiet around him, and the envelope still on the hallway table, and he felt something that he was not used to feeling and did not have a comfortable name for. It was the particular feeling of a man who has always believed he knew what was in the room and is beginning to suspect he was wrong. Not quite fear, not quite anger. Something that contained elements of both, without being either. A cold, careful alertness that was the opposite of the warm certainty he had always carried about his own life. He decided to wait. He decided to wait because he was a person who, when he was uncertain about something professional, always preferred to have more information before acting. He would approach this the same way. He would watch. He would wait for information to present itself. He would not accuse. He would not investigate in ways that crossed the line he had drawn for himself. He would wait for Nadia to tell him, or for something else to make things clear. This resolution cost him something. He was not naturally patient about unknowns. But he made the decision and committed to it with the same discipline he brought to professional decisions that required him to hold difficult positions, and he went back to work at his desk and tried to give his attention to the proposal he had been reading that morning. He could not give it his attention. He read the same paragraph 4 times and registered nothing about it. He gave up and made a list instead, a thing he did when his mind was too busy to focus. He made a list of what he knew and what he did not know, and the list was very short, and the second column was longer than the first, and looking at it made him feel no better. Nadia came home that evening from her shift. She came through the front door and dropped her bag in the hall and stopped, and he saw her notice the envelope. He was watching from the kitchen doorway, holding a glass of water, and he saw the exact moment she saw it, and the very particular stillness that moved through her when she did. She picked it up quickly. She put it in her bag. She came toward the kitchen without looking at him for the first 2 steps, and then she looked up and saw him in the doorway. "Hey," she said. Her voice was ordinary. "Hey," he said. "Good shift?" "Long," she said. "Have you eaten? I was going to make something." "Not yet." She moved past him into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator and began taking things out, and he watched her back, and he thought about what he had seen. The stillness, the speed with which she had moved the envelope from the table to her bag. He was certain, with a certainty that he did not need a finance app to confirm that what he had just witnessed was practiced. It was not a reaction to an unexpected thing. It was the trained response of a person who had been preparing for exactly this kind of moment. They ate dinner. The conversation was ordinary. They talked about something he had heard on the radio, about a friend of his whose child had just started at a new school, about the possibility of rain in the coming week. Nadia listened and contributed. She was present. She was warm. She was also, he understood now, behind a wall he had not known was there. He did not bring up the envelope. He had made a decision to wait, and he kept it, though it was harder than he had expected. After dinner she did the washing up, and he dried, the way they had fallen into doing over the years, and she hummed something quietly while her hands were in the water, and the kitchen was warm, and the ordinary domesticity of it pressed against the knot in his chest, in a way that was almost painful. He knew this kitchen, and this woman, and this routine. He was no longer certain he knew what was underneath it. He went to bed before her that night. He lay in the dark and listened to her moving through the house, heard her check the locks, heard her turn off the living room light, heard the sound of water in the bathroom, heard her come into the bedroom. She got into bed quietly. She lay still beside him. He could tell she was not asleep. Neither of them said anything for a long time. "Damien," she said eventually, quietly, into the dark. "Yes," he said. A silence. "Are you all right?" He thought about that question. He thought about how to answer it honestly without opening, yet, a door he was not sure either of them was ready for. "Tired," he said. "Long week." "Yes," she said. Another silence. He heard her breathing slow, and thought she might be falling asleep. Then she said, very quietly, "I'm going to tell you something. Not tonight, but soon." He lay still. He did not turn toward her. He kept his voice level. "Okay," he said. She did not say anything else. After a while, her breathing changed, and she was asleep. He stayed awake for a long time. In the weeks that followed Damien's discovery of what he could see but not yet explain, he carried the weight of what he knew, in the same silent way that Nadia had been carrying her own weight, without showing it, without letting it enter the ordinary conversations of their daily life, but feeling it constantly. He had not expected this to be his side of the equation. He had always been the one who knew things. He had never been the one sitting with the awareness that knowledge was being withheld from him, in his own house, by the person he had chosen to build his life with. He found himself paying attention to Nadia in a different way than he had before. Not with suspicion exactly. The feeling was not yet accusation, but with a heightened observation, the way you look at a landscape more carefully after someone suggests there is something in it you might have missed. And the more carefully he looked, the more he saw. He saw how she managed her time across shifts and patterns that now read differently to him than they had before. He saw the way she kept her phone face down on most surfaces. He saw the way she sometimes paused before answering a question, in a gap that was almost imperceptible, but was a beat longer than the pauses he had always known from her. He saw the envelope she had collected and moved to her bag and never mentioned, and he saw in that small transaction the evidence of a habit, something that had been happening for much longer than the single moment he had witnessed. He did not bring this up. He had told himself he would wait for her to speak, and he waited. During this period he spent more time in his study than usual, doing work, but also thinking. He thought about things he had not thought about in years, about the early months of their relationship, about conversations that had stayed in him without his fully unpacking them. He thought about what she had said on the balcony of their honeymoon hotel, that it was strange to begin something new when you were still carrying something old. He had assumed she was being philosophical. He understood now that she had been stating a fact, and the fact was one she had not been ready, at that moment, to explain. He thought about Gerald's note in the drawer. He opened the drawer and took out the envelope and read it again. "Take care of her. She has carried enough." He had read it as a general instruction, sentimental, from an uncle who loved his niece. He read it now as something more specific, and the specificity made his chest tight. He thought about his mother's voice on the phone in the first weeks of their marriage. She came into this marriage very light, nothing to bring to it financially. He thought about how he had quietly agreed with that, or at least not disagreed, and he thought about what it would mean if his mother had been wrong, not slightly wrong, not wrong in the way of overstatement, but wrong in the deeper way, the way that revealed something about what she had been looking at and chosen to see. On a Friday evening, 3 weeks after the evening in the dark when Nadia had said she would tell him something soon, he came home from the office to find the house empty. There was a note on the kitchen counter in Nadia's handwriting. Back later. Soup on the stove. He lifted the lid on the pot. The soup was good and warm, and she had left it on a low heat, so it would be ready whenever he needed it. He stood at the stove and looked at the soup and thought about how many times in their marriage she had done something like this. Something practical and caring and quietly done without announcement. He thought about all the things that had been done quietly in this house, and he thought about the fact that he had benefited from every one of them and had never asked, not once, what they had cost her. He went to his study. He opened the desk drawer. He took out Gerald's note, and he read it a third time, and this time he let the weight of it sit in him without trying to manage it. She has carried enough. He put the note on top of the desk where he could see it. He did not put it back in the drawer. He sat with it, and with the awareness, increasingly clear and increasingly uncomfortable, that the story he had been telling himself about his marriage, the story in which he was the one who had brought everything necessary and she had arrived with only herself, was not, had never been, the whole story. He did not yet know the full story, but he was beginning to understand that when it arrived, it was going to require him to do more than simply absorb new information. It was going to require him to look at himself in a way he had not been used to, and what he saw might not be easy to sit with. He stayed in his study until the house was fully dark outside, and then he went and ate the soup she had left him, alone at the kitchen table, and the house was very quiet, and he thought that he had been quiet in the wrong ways for a long time, and it was getting close to the time when that was going to have to change. It was a Saturday when Nadia told him everything, and it began the way that serious conversations between people who love each other often begin, not with a prepared speech, not with the words that had been rehearsed, but with an ordinary moment that became something more. They had been doing different things in different rooms all morning. Damien was in his study with the door half open, working through some firm accounts that Stuart had sent him. Nadia was in the kitchen, and she was not cooking or cleaning, or doing any of the practical things she usually did on Saturday mornings. She was sitting at the table with both hands around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, and she had been sitting that way for nearly 30 minutes. Damien walked past the kitchen doorway to get more water, and he saw her there. He stopped. She looked up. Their eyes met. She said, "Come in." He came in. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He did not say anything, because something in the air of the kitchen told him that what was about to happen required him to not fill the space with words. Nadia looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked at him. Her expression was the one he had been trying to name for 4 years, and now, as she opened her mouth to speak, he understood what it was. It was not resolve, as he had once thought, and it was not happiness or contentment, or the particular warmth of a woman who was grateful for what she had. It was something more complicated and more honest than any of those things. It was the expression of a person who has been carrying something alone and has finally decided to put it down. "There is something I have not told you," she said. "It has been there since before we got married, and I should have told you, and I didn't, and I'm going to tell you now." He waited. She told him. She began at the beginning, with her mother, with the illness, with the point at which the cost of the treatment outpaced everything the family had. She told him about Gerald, not with anger, but clearly, naming what he had done and why he had done it, and the position it had put her in. She told him about the loan, the source of it, the terms, the rate, the pressure. She told him how old she had been when it was taken out, and what state she had been in at the time, and what the alternative would have been, and why that alternative was not something she had been able to accept. She told him about the payments, 3 years of them, every month, from her own nursing salary, which she had managed and allocated and protected for this purpose since before they were married. She told him how much the balance had been when she started paying, and how much it was now, and what had changed in the last few months. She told him about the new holders of the debt. She told him about the shortened timeline. She told him about the letter that had come to the house, and she reached into her bag, which was on the chair beside her, and she took out both envelopes, the second one she had collected days before, and the first one, which she had never thrown away, because she had not been able to make herself throw away the evidence that the situation had become real in a new way, and she put them on the table between them. She told him about the grocery adjustments. She was precise about this, specific, naming the amounts and the periods and the reason, because she was not going to be unclear about any part of it. She told him about the credit union option she had looked at and decided against. She told him about the overtime shifts and what they had actually been for. She told him that she had not taken a single cent of his money to pay the debt. She said this not as a defense, but as a fact. She had managed it herself, in her own money, throughout. She was clear that this did not make the secrecy acceptable. She said so directly. She said, "I know that hiding this was wrong. I know it was a kind of dishonesty. I'm not asking you to disagree with that." She told him she had not told him in the beginning, because she had been afraid of losing him. She told him she had not told him later, because the fear had evolved into something more complex. Not just the fear of losing him, but the fear of changing what she was in his eyes. She told him she had watched him speak about people who hid financial problems, and she had heard what was underneath his words, and she had calculated that the truth would cost her more than the silence. She said, "I was wrong about that, not because the cost wasn't real, but because I made the decision for you. I decided what you would think and how you would respond, and I acted on that decision without ever giving you the chance to respond differently. That was not fair to you." She said, "I also need you to know that when I married you, I loved you. The debt was there, and Gerald had arranged the circumstances, and all of that is true. But I loved you. I didn't marry you because of the money. I married you because I wanted to. I need you to know that." Then she stopped talking. She had said everything she had been holding for 4 years, and saying it had taken about 25 minutes. And when she finished, she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not relief exactly, and not peace, but the particular sensation of no longer carrying weight in secret. She was lighter. Whatever happened next, she was lighter. Damien had not moved during any of this. He had sat across from her with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on her face, and he had not interrupted once. He was still now. The kitchen was very quiet. He looked at the envelopes on the table, then he looked back at her. He did not speak for what felt like a long time, but was probably less than a minute. Then he said, "How much is left?" She told him the number. He looked at his hands. He nodded once, slowly, the way he did when he was absorbing a piece of information in a professional context. She watched him do this, and recognized that he was processing the situation the way he processed all difficult situations, by immediately going to what was quantifiable, because the quantifiable was something he knew how to manage. The other parts of what she had told him, the years of silence, the fear, the secret hours, the wait, those were not quantifiable, and those were the parts that were going to take longer. He said, "Why didn't you tell me before the wedding?" She had expected this question. "Because I didn't know how," she said. "And because I looked at you, and I couldn't see a version of the conversation that didn't end with you looking at me differently." He was quiet. "I know that wasn't fair," she said again. "I know I was making assumptions about how you'd respond, instead of letting you respond." "Yes," he said. The word was not unkind, but it was undecorated. "Are you angry?" she said. He thought about it. He said, "I don't know what I am yet." She accepted that. It was honest, and she had just spent 25 minutes asking him to let honesty into the room. She could not object to honesty now. He picked up the 2 envelopes and looked at them. He turned them over. He put them back down. He said, "You've been doing this alone for the entire time I've known you." "Yes." "How many years before we met?" 3, so 6 total. He looked at his hands again. She watched his face and tried to read it, and found that she could read parts of it and not others, which was unusual. She had learned his face well over 4 years, and could usually tell what was in it. What she could see now was a kind of controlled internal movement, a man working through something that was not just information, but was a rearrangement of the way he understood things. And the rearrangement was happening in real time, and he was managing it the way he managed most things, by keeping the outside very still, while the inside sorted itself out. He said, "The grocery account." "Yes," she said. "I took small amounts out of the budget and moved them. It wasn't a large amount each month. I managed it so it wouldn't be obvious in the household numbers. I know what that sounds like." "How long?" "About 14 months. He nodded. He was still very still. "Damien," she said. She waited until he looked at her. "I didn't steal from you. The amounts I moved were amounts I would have spent on groceries. I just spent them differently. I know the distinction is thin, and I know you might not draw that line where I draw it, and if you don't, I understand." He looked at her for a long moment, then he said, "Gerald arranged for you to marry me." "Gerald arranged the circumstances," she said. "I made the choice." "There's a difference?" "Yes, a real one. Because I met you, and I fell in love with you, and I said yes, because I wanted to, not because I was told to. I need you to hear that." He stood up from the table. He walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the garden. She watched his back. He said, without turning around, "My mother said you came into this marriage with nothing. I heard her say it. I heard people say it in different ways, and I think a part of me believed it." "I know," she said. "That was wrong of me." She did not say anything. He turned from the window. "You've been paying a debt for 6 years. That's what you brought. You brought a debt that was keeping your mother alive, and you paid every cent of it yourself, and you never asked me for anything, not once." His voice was still controlled, but something in it had changed. She heard it. She did not respond immediately, because the right response in this moment was to let him finish. "And I was the one," he said, "sitting here thinking I was the generous one. Thinking I was the one who gave the most. Thinking." He stopped. He pressed his lips together briefly. "I thought I was holding everything up. I thought this whole arrangement existed because of what I brought to it." "You did bring a great deal," she said. "Don't," he said. Not harshly, but firmly. "Don't minimize what I got wrong. I'm not ready for that yet." She nodded. He sat back down at the table. He picked up the envelopes again and put them down. He said, "Who else knows about this? Which members of my family?" She had been waiting for this. "Your mother knows the debt existed," she said. "I don't know how much she knows. Gerald told me once that there was an understanding, at the beginning, between him and certain members of your family. I never asked for more detail, because I didn't want more detail." He looked at her. "My mother knew." "I believe she knew something," Nadia said carefully. "I can't tell you exactly what." The expression on his face changed. What had been internal and complex shifted into something more focused. This was a different kind of information, not information that required him to rearrange his understanding of himself, but information that pointed outward, at someone else. "Why didn't she tell me?" he said. "You would have to ask her," Nadia said. "I can only tell you what I know." He was quiet. She could see him adding something up, not numbers, but something harder to calculate. Something about who had known what, and when, and what it meant that they had known, and had said nothing to him. His mother, who had patted Nadia's hand at the wedding reception and said, "So simple," with a smile that contained more than warmth. His mother, who had called him in the first weeks of the marriage to talk about how Nadia had come with nothing, and he was the generous one. His mother had known, and she had not told him. She had sat with that knowledge and used it. He looked at Nadia across the table and said, "I'm not going to react to all of this the right way immediately. I want to. I want to tell you the right things. But I need some time to sit with what you've told me before I can do that honestly." She nodded. "But I need you to know one thing right now," he said. "I'm not going to pretend I wasn't angry, because I am. I am angry about the secrecy, not about the debt. The debt is something that happened to you, and I understand why it happened. But the 4 years of carrying it alone, while sitting across this table from me every night, that I need time with. That's fair," she said. "I'm also—" He stopped. He started again. "I'm also aware that some of the reason you felt you couldn't tell me is something that I made. The things I've said about people and money, the way I talk about these things. I know that's something I have to look at." She looked at him. She had not expected him to say that so quickly. She had expected him to come to it eventually. But not today. Not in the same conversation. "Yes," she said quietly. He pushed back from the table and stood up again. He was not leaving the room. He was just the kind of person who needed to stand when he was processing something of weight. "I'm going to need to think," he said. "I know. Don't go anywhere." She almost smiled at that. "Where would I go?" He looked at her, and there was something in his face she had not seen before. Something that was not the confident, settled expression of a man who had things arranged the way he wanted them, but something rawer and more real. The expression of a man who had just had the floor shift beneath him, and was discovering that he did not, as he had always believed, know exactly where the ground was. He went out of the kitchen. She heard him go into his study. She heard the door close, not hard, just close. She sat at the kitchen table and looked at the cold coffee in her cup, and thought about what she had just done, and felt, for the first time in 4 years, something that was close to peace. Not comfort, not certainty about what came next, but the particular peace of someone who has finally stopped running from a thing, and has turned around and stood still. The 2 envelopes were still on the table between the chairs where they had been sitting. She picked them up. She held them for a moment. Then she put them in the bin. Whatever happened next, those letters did not need to live in her bag anymore. The 3 days after Nadia's confession were the strangest days Damien could remember living through. Not because the house became hostile or cold, not because either of them did anything dramatic. It was the opposite of drama, in fact. The house was very quiet, and they moved through it with a careful consideration of each other that was different from the ordinary consideration of a well-functioning marriage. It was the consideration of 2 people who were both aware that something significant had changed, and were not yet certain what the new shape of things would be. Damien went to work. He sat in meetings. He answered emails. He read the proposal he had been unable to concentrate on before, and approved it, and moved on to the next thing. He was, professionally, entirely functional. Professionally was the only register in which he was operating without a constant interior disturbance, and he stayed in the office later than usual for 2 of those 3 days, simply because the office did not require him to look at his own life. At home, he was not cold to Nadia. He was not unkind. He spoke to her, answered her, ate the meals she made, and asked about her shifts. But he was inside himself, in a way she could feel, doing the processing he had told her he needed to do, and she gave him room for it, because she understood that the room was necessary, and she had, after all, had 4 years to sit with the situation, while he was absorbing it for the first time. She watched him the way she had learned to watch him over 4 years, not intrusively, not with demands, but with the steady awareness of someone who knows a person well, and is paying attention to how they are moving through something difficult. What she observed was that he was angry, and that the anger was directed at several things simultaneously, and that he was sorting those things out in order of what he could deal with most cleanly. The debt itself was not where the anger sat. She could tell this. He had asked her the amount immediately, and had received it without the reaction she had feared, without the cold evaluation she had expected, without the look she had dreaded. The debt was information that he was processing with the part of him that was logical and capable and good at solving things. That part of him was already, she thought, working on a plan, because working on a plan was what he did with problems, and the debt was a problem with a clear solution. And clear solutions were where Damien felt most in command. What he was not processing cleanly was everything else. The years of silence. The secret architecture she had built inside their shared life. The small adjustments to the household budget. The overtime shifts whose real purpose he had only just understood. He was processing the realization that the marriage he had believed himself to be fully inside had a room he had not known about, and that room had been occupied for the entire time. He was also processing something that was harder than any of the practical elements, and it was this: the understanding that the woman across the table from him had looked at him, at the way he talked, at the way he held his certainties, at the way he described people who had made financial mistakes, and had decided that he was not the kind of person she could tell the truth to. She had made that decision based on evidence, not on misunderstanding, not on a false picture of him, on evidence. He had provided that evidence, steadily, over the course of their relationship, without knowing he was doing it. That was the hardest thing to sit with. Not that she had hidden something, but that she had hidden something because of something real she had observed in him. On the 3rd day, a Sunday, he stayed home. He came into the kitchen in the morning while Nadia was making breakfast, and he sat down at the table, the same chair he had sat in on Saturday, 3 days earlier, and she brought him coffee without being asked, and sat down across from him, and he looked at her and said, "I've been thinking." "I know," she said. "I owe you something," he said. "Not money. I mean, I owe you an acknowledgement." She waited. "I have been," he said, and then he stopped, and she watched him choose his words with care, the way he did when something mattered. "I have been operating inside this marriage with the belief that I was the one who made it possible, that my contribution was the central thing. that everything else existed around it. He paused. That belief was wrong. And the reason it was wrong is not just because you were quietly managing something I didn't know about. It's wrong because even without the debt, even if there had been no debt at all, I was still treating this marriage as though my financial contribution was the whole measure of what I was bringing, and treating you as though your contribution only counted as much as I decided it did. Nadia was very still. I don't know when I became that person, he said. I don't think I was always that person. I think it grew in me slowly, and I didn't notice because it was comfortable not to notice. Damien, I'm not asking for reassurance, he said, not harshly, but clearly. I'm not saying this so you'll tell me I'm a good man. I'm saying it because it's true, and because I need to say it out loud. She looked at him, and did not say anything. I also need to say, he continued, that some of the reason you didn't feel you could tell me is my fault, directly. The things I've said about money, about people who have financial problems, about the difference between people who have discipline and people who don't. I have said those things in this house, in front of you, and I didn't notice what they were doing. I was telling you, every time I said those things, that you were in a category I looked down on. And then I was wondering why you didn't tell me the truth. He stopped. He put both hands around his coffee cup. He looked at the table. I'm angry about the secrecy, he said. I'm not going to pretend I'm not. I'm angry that you managed this alone when you didn't have to, and I'm angry at myself that you felt you had to. Both of those things are true at the same time. Nadia said, I'm sorry for the secrecy. I am genuinely sorry for that. He looked up at her. I know, he said. I believe you. There was a silence between them that was different from the silences of the previous 3 days. Those had been working silences, silences full of internal processing. This was a different kind. It was the silence of two people who have both said something true and are now sitting in the truth together, which is always a different kind of quiet than the silence of avoidance. What do you want to do? She said. He understood what she was asking. She was asking about the debt. She was asking about them. She was asking about what came next. About the debt, he said. I want to clear it. Not because I'm the provider, and that's what providers do. Because it's a problem that has a solution, and the solution is money, and I have the money, and there's no reason for it to exist any longer. He looked at her steadily. But I'm not doing it as a power move. I'm not clearing it so that you owe me something new. I need you to understand that. I understand, she said. And about us, he said. I think we need to talk. Not just once. I think we have been managing each other at a distance that I didn't see before, and I would like that to be different. She said. I would like that too. He stood up and went to the counter and poured his coffee out and refilled it with fresh coffee from the pot. And when he turned back, she was still looking at him. And he thought about the expression on her face that he had been trying to name for 4 years. He looked at it now and understood it finally. It was not resolve. It was not contentment. It was the expression of someone who was fully, carefully present. Someone who was paying attention at every moment to the truth of what was in front of them, without the protection of certainty, without the comfort of a story that had already been decided. She had always been seeing him clearly. He was only now beginning to see her the same way. He sat back down. He said, Tell me about Gerald. What was the actual arrangement? She told him. She told him, in more detail than she had managed on Saturday, about the conversation between Gerald and the person who had organized the introduction. She told him what she knew of who had spoken to whom, and in what order, and with what intention. She was careful to distinguish between what she knew and what she had inferred, because she was a precise person, and precision had always been the thing she trusted, when everything else felt uncertain. As she talked, something moved through Damien that was separate from what he felt about Nadia. It was a cooler, more specific feeling, directed not inward, and not at her, but outward. Toward Gerald, who had arranged things, and toward his mother, who had known. He had been thinking about his mother since Saturday, turning the knowledge over, sitting with the shape of it. His mother had known at least some part of what Nadia carried, had known the arrangement that had preceded the wedding, and she had said nothing to him. She had instead said, in the first weeks of their marriage, that Nadia had come with nothing, that Nadia was lucky, that he was the generous one. His mother had known, and she had used the knowledge not to tell him the truth, but to reinforce a version of things that made herself feel comfortable and made him feel superior, and kept Nadia in a position where his mother held power over the information in her life. He had to sit with that. He did not say much more that morning. He and Nadia ate breakfast, and the kitchen was quiet, and the house was Sunday quiet outside. The kind of quiet that feels like everything is in suspension, waiting. After they had eaten, he washed up and she dried, the way they always did, and while they were doing it he said, "You should have told me." "Yes," she said, "I know. But I understand why you didn't." She looked at him with something in her face that he could not read, not because it was hidden but because it was complicated. Relief, and guilt, and something warm, and something tired, all present at once. He thought that this was probably closer to her real face than anything he had seen from her before, not the arranged version of herself that she presented when she was managing. This. "What do we do about my mother?" she said. He thought about that. "I'm going to talk to her," he said. "Not today, but soon." "Be careful," she said. "I will." They went about the rest of the Sunday, in a way that looked ordinary from the outside, and was not ordinary at all from the inside. He read in the living room. She went for a walk alone in the early afternoon, which she sometimes did, and he had always respected. When she came back she looked slightly better, in the way that people who have carried things often look after they have let them go. Lighter, but also tired, the way physical muscles feel after a long-held tension is finally released. That evening he went to his study and made some calculations. He worked out the remaining debt amount, the best and most private route to clearing it, without creating a paper trail that would require awkward explanations later, the timeline. He was efficient about it. He made notes. He felt, doing this, the satisfaction of applying a capability he genuinely had to a problem that genuinely needed it. Not from a position of superiority, from a position of usefulness. He thought, while he was writing down numbers, about what his mother had said at the wedding reception, which he had not heard directly, but which had reached him later through his uncle's account. He thought about what she had said in the first weeks of the marriage. He thought about her visits, the look she gave Nadia's clothing and Nadia's phone, the way she had patted Nadia's hand. He thought about the fact that he had heard all of it and not pushed back, not once. He had allowed her version of his marriage to exist unchallenged in his mother's mind, and in the minds of the family members she spoke to, and in some part of his own mind, because the version was flattering to him, and he had not been uncomfortable enough with it to look at it directly. He put his pen down and closed the notebook. He had thought, for 4 years, that the problem with his marriage was that Nadia had brought nothing to it. He understood now that the problem with his marriage was something different entirely. The problem was that he had spent 4 years looking in the wrong direction. He turned off the desk lamp and sat in the dark study for a few minutes before going to find his wife, and in those minutes he allowed himself to simply sit with the understanding that he had work to do. Not financial work, the other kind. The kind that does not have a clear solution and does not come with numbers you can track, and cannot be resolved by making a plan, but requires instead a sustained and honest attention to the truth of what you have been and what you have failed to be, and a genuine commitment to the harder, quieter work of becoming something different. He got up and went to find Nadia. She was in the living room, reading, with the lamp on and her legs tucked under her, and a cup of tea on the table beside her. She looked up when he came in. He sat down beside her, not across from her, beside her. She looked at him. "I'm going to need some time," he said, "to get this right." "I know," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." She put her hand on his arm. It was a simple gesture, small and direct, and it said more than either of them had managed to say in the conversation of the past 3 days. He put his hand over hers. They sat like that for a while, not reading, not speaking, just present in the same room, in a way they had not been, fully and honestly, for longer than either of them had understood until now. Outside, the evening came down in the ordinary way it always did. The streetlights came on, a car passed, somewhere nearby a door closed. The world went about its quiet evening business, indifferent and constant. Inside the house, 2 people sat in a living room and began, slowly and without ceremony, the work of actually knowing each other. Damien called his mother on a Wednesday morning. He had waited a week. He had needed the week to be certain about what he was going to say and how he was going to say it. because he was aware that the conversation he was about to have was one that could not be taken back once it was in the air between them. He had spent the week returning, in his thoughts, to the specific things he knew, and separating them from the things he had assumed, and he had arrived at a version of what he understood that was as accurate as he could make it, given the information available to him. He preferred to go into difficult conversations informed. That had not changed. His mother answered after the second ring. She was always available in the mornings. She had a routine that included a specific period for calls and correspondence, and she had maintained this routine for as long as he could remember, because structure was something Francis Osei believed in deeply, which was one of the things he had inherited from her, and which was also, he had been recognizing over the past week, something that could become a rigidity if it was not held carefully. "Damien," she said, with the warmth that came automatically in her voice when she spoke to him. "Are you well?" "I need to talk with you about something," he said. A short pause. She had known him for 36 years, and she could read the weight of a sentence, as well as anyone. "All right," she said. "I know about the debt," he said. "I know about the arrangement before the wedding. I know you were informed about some of it. I would like to know what you knew, and I would like you to tell me honestly." The silence that followed was longer than a pause. It was a silence that held shape and texture, and he had learned to read his mother's silences over the years, and this one told him that she had been waiting for this call, or something like it, for longer than she would admit. "Damien," she said, and her voice was careful in a way that it only became when she was deciding how much to disclose. "Please don't manage me," he said. "I am asking you directly. What did you know?" She said, "Gerald came to me before the engagement. He told me about the family's financial situation, the debt, the details of it, the circumstances." "He came to you?" "Yes." "Before the engagement?" "Yes." He processed that. Gerald had gone to his mother, not to him. To his mother. "Why to you?" he said. "Because he wanted to know whether the family, your side, would have an issue with it, whether you would call things off if you knew. He wanted to understand the situation before it became a formal proposal." "And you told him?" "I told him," she said, after a moment, "that if Nadia and you were genuinely suited, and if the situation was being managed, then it didn't need to be raised at that time." The air was very still, on his side of the phone. "You told him," Damien said slowly, "that you didn't think I needed to know." "I told him it didn't need to be raised. That is the same thing, Mother." She did not deny it. He said, "And then you called me in the first weeks of my marriage, and told me that Nadia had come with nothing. You said she was lucky to have me. You used those words. I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did," he said, not loudly. He was not a person who shouted, and he was not shouting now. His voice was level and quiet, and it carried everything it needed to carry, without requiring volume. "You meant exactly that. You knew that Nadia was carrying a debt from her mother's treatment, that she had been paying it for years, that she came into our marriage with a financial burden that any reasonable person would describe as significant, and you called me to tell me she had come with nothing." Silence. "You sat on information about the person I married," he said, "and you used the gap created by your silence to make yourself feel better about what I had done, to feel that you were still above it, to make Nadia feel like she was in a position of debt to us, not in the financial sense, but the other kind. That's not, Mother." He said it with enough quiet firmness that she stopped. "I am not calling to argue with you. I am calling because I need you to understand what your silence cost. And then I would like to tell you what I am going to do about it, and I would like you to hear that too." Another silence. When she spoke again, something in her voice was different. Not defeated. Francis was not a person who became defeated easily, but more careful. And underneath the caution, something that might have been the beginning of discomfort. "I didn't think it was my place to tell you," she said. "You made it your place when you said the things you said to me in the first weeks of my marriage. I was worried about you." "No," he said. "You were managing a situation to produce the outcome you preferred, which was a son who felt he had married well, who felt he was the generous one, the capable one, the one who had arranged everything, because that reflects well on you, on the family, on the decisions you had approved of." She did not respond to this immediately. "I'm not telling you that you don't love me," he said. "I know you do. I'm telling you that love is not always a clean thing, and sometimes it does what suits the person who feels it, more than it does what's right for the person it's directed at. And what you did was not right. Not for Nadia, and not for me. When his mother spoke again, she spoke more quietly than she had been speaking. "How is she?" she said. He understood that this was the closest his mother would come, in this conversation, to an acknowledgement that things had not been handled well. Frances expressed remorse sideways, in inquiries about the welfare of the person she had wronged, rather than in direct statements of apology, and he had known this about her for long enough to recognize it. "She's managing," he said. "She is always managing. That's the thing about Nadia. She manages everything." "Yes," his mother said, and there was something in that single word that surprised him. A recognition, quiet and without decoration, that was more honest than anything else she had said. "I want you to think," he said, "about what you said to her on our wedding day. What you said about her dress. What you said at the reception. What you said in the years since. I would like you to think about all of that, and to consider what it would have cost her to hear it, while carrying what she was carrying. And then I would like you to think about whether you want to speak to her differently going forward." He did not demand an apology. He did not tell her what to do. He told her what he wanted her to think about, and he let the thinking be her own, because he was not in the business of managing his mother's conscience. He was in the business of telling the truth about what had happened, and he had done that. He ended the call. He sat at his desk for a few minutes after. He was not shaking, because he was not a person who shook, but there was something physical in him that registered the effort of the conversation. A tightness across his shoulders, a sensation of heat that came after difficult things were said and could not be unsaid. He let it be there, and then he got up and made a cup of coffee and went back to work. He did not tell Nadia about the call immediately. He waited until that evening, and then he told her, clearly and completely, what he had said and what his mother had said. He did not edit it. He did not protect either his mother or himself from the accuracy of it. Nadia listened with her hands in her lap and her eyes on him, and when he was finished, she said, "Thank you." He said, "I should have pushed back on her a long time ago." "You didn't know what you were pushing back against." "Some of it I knew," he said, "not the debt, but the way she spoke about you. I let that go on, because I didn't see the harm in it." He paused. "That was careless." "It was," she said, "not unkindly, not with heat, just accurately." He had asked her, the previous evening, if she wanted to be present for the conversation with his mother, and she had said no. She had said she thought it needed to happen between him and Frances without her there, because the conversation was partly about her but not entirely, and the part that was not about her was something that existed between a son and his mother and did not need her as a mediator. He had agreed, and he had been glad of her clarity on that, because he had found himself respecting, these past weeks, the way she thought about things, the way she separated what was hers to carry from what was not, the way she was direct without being aggressive, the way she held positions without needing to perform them. He had known her for over 4 years. He was beginning to understand that he had not fully known her until now. 3 days after the call to his mother, Damien drove to Gerald's house. He had not told Gerald he was coming. He had the address from a family directory that had been compiled years ago for gatherings, and he drove there in the early evening on a weekday and parked outside, and sat for a moment before getting out. Gerald's house was a modest place with a neat garden and a front door that needed painting. Damien knocked. Gerald answered after a short wait. He was wearing old clothes, the kind a person wears when they are at home, with no intention of going anywhere. And when he saw who was at the door, his face moved through several expressions, in quick succession, before settling into something that was most accurately described as resigned. "Damien," he said. "Gerald, may I come in?" Gerald stepped back and let him in. They sat in Gerald's sitting room. It was clean and somewhat spare, and smelled faintly of something cooked earlier in the day. Gerald sat across from Damien and put his hands on his knees and waited, with the posture of a man who has been expecting an accounting and has decided to face it directly. Damien told him what Nadia had told him. He wanted to confirm the details, not because he doubted her, but because he wanted to hear it from Gerald himself. Gerald confirmed everything. He did not elaborate or expand. He did not excuse. He answered what was asked, and said nothing unnecessary. "You went to my mother before the engagement," Damien said. "Yes." "Why to her and not to me?" Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because I didn't know you. I knew she was the one who would decide whether the family approved. In the community where your family moves, it's the senior women who make those determinations. She was the one who needed to be informed." Damien thought about that. There was a logic to it, he could see. Even if the logic had produced a result he could not approve of. Gerald had been operating inside a set of social rules that had their own internal coherence. What had gone wrong was not that Gerald had followed those rules, but that his mother had received the information and used it in the way she had. "You told her not to tell me," Damien said. Gerald shifted in his chair. "I asked her to use her judgment about whether it needed to be raised before the engagement. And she judged that it didn't." "Yes." "Did you agree with that judgment?" Gerald was quiet for a longer moment. Then he said, "I thought Nadia would tell you herself, in time. I thought the arrangement would give them both time to settle into something where telling would be easier." Damien looked at him. "And the note you put in the envelope at our wedding. Take care of her. She has carried enough. You knew, when you wrote that, exactly what you meant." Gerald looked at him steadily. "Yes," he said. "I knew what I meant." "Why a note? Why not just tell me?" "Because," Gerald said. And for the first time in the conversation, his voice carried something heavier than resignation. "I had done something that made this situation. I had arranged the loan. I had brought these people into her life. Whatever followed from that was something I had to live with. The note was all I could think to do. It was not enough. I know that." The room was very quiet. Damien said, "She paid every payment for 6 years. She never missed one. I know she didn't. She took extra nursing shifts to cover the increases. She managed the household budget differently to create room. She carried this completely alone." "Yes. And you sent her a note." Gerald did not look away. "I know what I did and what I didn't do," he said. "I won't defend it to you. You have a right to whatever you feel about it." Damien looked at him for a long time. He thought about anger. He had expected to feel more of it, sitting in this room. What he felt instead was something more complicated, an understanding of Gerald as a person who had made a significant error and had been living with the weight of it in his own way, which did not make the error smaller, but made it human-sized, which was different from making it acceptable. He said, "What I'm going to do is clear the remaining debt. The current holder will receive the full balance from me directly, through my solicitor. I would like the contact with Nadia to stop entirely. All future communication about this goes through me, then to my solicitor, then done." Gerald nodded. He looked like a man who had been waiting to hear that someone was going to take the weight. "I need the names of the current contacts," Damien said. Gerald gave them. Damien wrote them down. He stood up. He said, "I'm not going to tell you how to handle your relationship with Nadia going forward. That's between the two of you, and it's not mine to manage. What I will say is that she loves you, despite everything. That's not something I understand easily, but it's true, and I think you should know it." Gerald's jaw moved slightly. He looked down at his hands. Damien put his notebook in his jacket pocket and walked to the front door. Gerald followed him. At the door, Damien turned. "She was 20 years old," he said. "When this started, she was 20 years old. Her mother was dying, and the people around her made decisions that put her in a position she spent the next 6 years paying for. I want you to sit with that." He left. He drove home. The evening was dark, and the streets were quiet, and he drove without music, in the particular silence of someone who has said what needed to be said and is now on the other side of it. He thought about Nadia at 20, a person he had not known then, a person who had been dealing with things at that age that most people never deal with at any age, with no one who could help effectively, with a mother who was sick, and a father who was gone, and an uncle who had meant well, and had made things worse, and a system of informal obligation that had no mechanism for protecting the most vulnerable person inside it. He had spent 4 years thinking she had come to him with nothing. She had come to him carrying more than he would ever fully know. He pulled into the driveway of his house and sat in the car for a moment before going inside. The lights were on in the living room window, warm and ordinary. He could see the shape of the lamp and the edge of the bookcase and the small movement of something, probably the television. He sat in the car and looked at the lit window and thought about how easy it is to look at a house from outside and believe you know what's inside it, and how wrong that belief can be. He got out of the car and went in. The solicitor's name was Karen Aldridge, and she had worked with Damien for 3 years on various business matters. She was precise and unhurried, and absolutely trustworthy, which were the 3 qualities he valued most in a professional. And he had called her the morning after his visit to Gerald and explained what he needed. She had not asked why. Karen never asked why, unless the why was legally relevant. She had taken the names Gerald had given him, had made a series of inquiries over the following week that Damien did not ask about in detail, because detail was her domain, and he trusted her to work within it, and she had come back to him at the end of 10 days with a clear picture of what was owed, and to whom, and the most efficient way to resolve it. The resolution cost Damien a significant amount of money, not a catastrophic amount. He had arranged his finances well over many years, and the firm was in a strong position, but significant. The kind of amount that required him to move money from one account to another and adjust some investment projections, and accept that certain things he had been planning to do in the coming year would need to wait. He made these adjustments without difficulty. He did not think of them as sacrifice. He thought of them as simple mathematics. A problem had a cost. He had the means to meet the cost, and the problem should therefore be resolved. Karen handled the contact with the current debt holder. She was good at this. The communication was formal and documented, and entirely through professional channels, and the result was an agreement to accept the lump sum as full settlement. Damien signed the relevant documents. Karen filed them. The transaction completed. He told Nadia on a Thursday evening. He came home and sat across from her at the kitchen table. He was spending more time at that table now, sitting across from her in conversation, rather than next to her in parallel. And he said, "It's done. The debt is cleared. Karen has the documentation." She looked at him. "I didn't do it as a gesture," he said. "I did it because it needed doing, and the most efficient way to do it was for me to do it. I don't want any of this to become something you owe me." She said, "I know. I mean it," he said. "This is not a new arrangement. This is me closing something that should have been closed years ago, if things had been different." "I understand," she said, "and I'm grateful. But you need to understand something too." She was looking at him steadily. "The fact that it's done, it means a great deal to me. Not because you spent money. Because of what it represents. You knew everything, and you didn't step back. You moved toward it." He looked at her. "That matters," she said, "more than the money." He considered that. "I should have been someone you could tell," he said, "earlier, a long time ago." "You are that person now," she said. He did not know, quite, how to receive that. He was not yet comfortable receiving kindness about things he considered his own failures. But he nodded, and she seemed to understand that the nod was the best he could do in that direction at that moment, and she let it be. That evening they sat in the living room and talked for a long time, not about the debt specifically, and not about the past specifically, but about things they had not talked about before, about how they each thought about money, about where those ways of thinking had come from, about the families that had shaped them. Nadia talked about what it had been like to grow up in a house where the difference between the right month and the wrong month was the difference between stability and crisis. She talked about the specific kind of alertness that produces, the constant monitoring, the way you learn to read the room for financial weather, the way you become very good at appearing unbothered when you are bothered. Damien listened in a way he had not listened before, not to respond, not to solve, but just to understand. He talked about his father, Charles, and about the way Charles had made financial discipline into something almost moral, the right way and the wrong way. He talked about inheriting that framework and never having examined it, about how easy it was to take a set of values that were genuinely good, discipline, responsibility, care with money, and let them calcify into something harder and less generous. He said it was easier to call something a lack of discipline than to try to understand the circumstances that produced it. He said he had been doing that for years without examining it. Nadia listened and did not offer comfort and did not offer challenge. She let him say what he was saying, and he was grateful for that. They sat until late. When they went to bed, the house had a different quality than it had had in the weeks before. Not resolved. They were not people who would pretend that a few conversations had straightened everything that had been bent over 4 years, but honest. There was an honesty in the air of the house now that had not been there before, and both of them could feel it, and both of them, in their separate and similar ways, found it more comfortable than the alternative. In the weeks that followed, Damien began doing something he had not done before in their marriage. He began asking Nadia things, not the practical logistical questions of two people running a shared household, but real questions. He asked what she actually liked and didn't like about their life. He asked what she wished were different. He asked what she needed from him that she had not been getting. He asked these questions not all at once, not in a single confessional conversation, but over time, in ordinary moments, in the way that genuine curiosity shows up, gradually, consistently, without an agenda. She found it startling at first. She had been married to a man who communicated in declarations and plans, and these questions were a different language, and she needed a moment each time to understand that they were real questions, not rhetorical ones. But she answered them, gradually, with increasing confidence that she would not be managed or evaluated for her answers. She answered them honestly. She said that she had sometimes felt invisible inside their financial life, not because he was unkind about money, but because the way he organized it had never really made room for her as a participant. She said the household budget had always been his to define and hers to manage within, and that those were different roles, and she had felt the difference. She said she had wanted, more than once, to suggest a different approach to something financial, and had not, because the financial domain had never felt like hers to enter. He said, "Why didn't you say that?" She gave him a look that contained several years of answer in it. He said, "Right." He opened the household accounts to her, fully, not as something presented for review, but as a genuine shared domain. He showed her everything. He explained the investment structure and asked her what she thought. He asked about the grocery budget and whether it was the right amount, and she told him, directly and without apology, that the amount had been set without accounting for the actual cost of fresh food in their area, and had been tight from the beginning. He adjusted it. He did not make a speech about the adjustment, he just adjusted it. He also changed the way he paid for things. For most of their marriage, he had paid for everything, which he had considered generosity, and which he was beginning to understand was also, in part, a way of maintaining a particular structure. He had been the one with full knowledge of all the money. He had been the one who could see the whole picture. This had felt like responsibility to him. He was beginning to understand that it had also felt like something else to her. He set up a joint account with genuine equal access, and transferred a meaningful amount from his own accounts into it, not as an allowance. He used the word only to understand precisely why he was not doing it as an allowance, but as their shared resource, belonging to both of them, managed by both of them, neither one waiting for the other's permission. Nadia looked at the account statement when he set this up and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "This is what it should have been from the start." "Yes," he said, "I know." He also contacted Stuart at the firm and made a small adjustment to a contract that Nadia had never known about. Early in their marriage, when he had described her income as supplementary, he had included in his own financial planning the assumption that if they ever had children, her nursing salary would eventually be replaced by his income. He had, without ever discussing it with her, built this assumption into his long-term financial projections. He removed the assumption. He told Stuart it was no longer relevant to the planning model. Stuart adjusted the model without comment. Damien did not tell Nadia about this. He thought about whether to tell her, and decided that some adjustments were private corrections, things you fixed because they were wrong, not things you announced because you wanted credit for fixing them. She did not need to know about every revision he was making to the architecture of his private thinking. She needed to see the results of those revisions in the way he actually behaved, and she would. His mother called him 2 weeks after their conversation. Frances called mid-morning, the way she always did, and she began with the usual warmth, and then after a few minutes of ordinary conversation she said, "I have been thinking about what you said." "And?" he said. "I should have told you," she said. "When Gerald came to me, I should have told you and let you make your own decision." He waited. "I told myself I was protecting you," she said, "from making a decision with too much information, too much complicated information, when the two of you were still new. I told myself that." But, a silence. "But I think," she said, in a voice that was more careful than her usual voice, more stripped of the social management she normally applied to difficult things. I think I wanted to be the one who held the full picture. I wanted to know something that you didn't, and I wanted to see whether Nadia would tell you herself. And when she didn't, I told myself she was unsuitable in ways she hadn't fully revealed to you yet, his mother said, and that made me feel. She stopped. Comfortable? He said. She did not deny it. You felt comfortable believing she had hidden something from me, he said, because it confirmed what you already thought about her. I'm not proud of it, she said. I know, he said. I also know it's not simple. You didn't want her to fail. You wanted to feel right about your concerns. There's a difference, but the result was the same. She asked again how Nadia was doing. He told her Nadia was well. He said the debt was cleared. He heard his mother draw a quiet breath at that. He thought about what it meant to her to hear that. Not relief, he thought, but a kind of accounting settling, the sense of a bill finally paid. Would she see me? His mother said. He thought about that. You would need to ask her, he said. Not through me. You would need to call her yourself and ask. There was a pause. All right, his mother said. He did not know whether Frances would make that call, or what would happen if she did. He had told her what he thought. He had not given her a script. Whatever came next between his mother and Nadia was something that would need to find its own form, without him in the middle of it, because he was not the bridge between them. He was Nadia's husband, and that was a different and more specific role. He thought about that word, husband, in the weeks of this period, turning it over occasionally the way you turn over a word when you are reconsidering what it means. He had thought he understood what it meant. He had thought it meant provider, organizer, the person who arranged the structure within which everything else existed. He had thought it meant the person who brought the most, and therefore knew the most, and therefore decided the most. He had thought all of these things so quietly and automatically that he had never recognized them as things he was thinking. They had simply been the shape of his understanding, the invisible water he swam in. He was swimming in different water now. It was not more comfortable, not in the short term. It required more of him, more attention, more honesty, more willingness to be wrong, and to say so. More of the kind of presence that does not get to maintain a comfortable distance. But it felt more real. He was living more inside the actual facts of his life than he had been, and there was something clarifying about that, even when it was hard. He came home one evening to find Nadia in the kitchen with the radio on, making something that smelled good and complicated, and she had her back to him, and was singing along to something under her breath, and she did not know he was there yet. He stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her for a moment. He thought about the expression he had been unable to name for 4 years, the one that had now resolved itself into clarity when he understood that she had always been fully present, always paying attention, never performing. He thought about all the things she had held in that presence without letting them show. He thought about the wedding day, and the simple dress, and the market flowers, and the way she had walked toward him with her chin up and her eyes straight ahead. He had seen that walk and thought, she is lucky to have this. He understood now that he had been looking at a woman who was walking toward him, carrying the weight of 6 years of quiet survival, carrying it so well that it was invisible, and who had decided, genuinely, freely, in spite of everything that was attached to the decision, to build a life with him. She had not been lucky. He had been. He said her name. She turned from the stove. She saw him in the doorway, and smiled. And it was a real smile, the warm, unguarded version that had been appearing more frequently, now that the weight was gone, and the kitchen was warm, and the food smelled good, and she was standing in their house, looking at him, as though he were a person she was glad to come home to. He crossed the kitchen. He said, "Can I do anything?" She handed him a wooden spoon and pointed at a pan that needed stirring. He took the spoon and started stirring, and she went back to what she was doing, and they stood at the stove together in the warm kitchen, with the radio playing something he half recognized, and the evening outside was ordinary and dark, and neither of them said anything for a while. It was the most ordinary kind of evening, unremarkable in every surface detail. He would remember it for a very long time. Frances came to the house on a Saturday afternoon in early autumn. She had called Nadia, as Damien had told her to. She had called on a Tuesday evening, about 3 weeks after the conversation with her son, and the call had been short and somewhat formal in the way that Frances's difficult conversations were always formal at the beginning. She put structure around them because structure was how she managed the things that frightened her. She had said she would like to see Nadia. She had said she hoped that might be possible. Nadia had listened, and then she had said, "Come to the house. Saturday afternoon, come for tea." Damien had offered to be there. Nadia had said she preferred to do it alone. He had accepted this, and he had made himself scarce that afternoon, going to the office for a few hours, which was something he rarely did on weekends, but which gave him something useful to do while his wife and his mother sat in his kitchen and had a conversation that he was not part of and had no right to be part of. He did not ask Nadia for a report when he came home. He came in, and she was in the living room reading, and she looked up at him when he entered, and he raised an eyebrow. The small, silent question. She said, "It was all right." He nodded. She looked back at her book. He went and made tea, and brought her a cup, and sat down with his own, and they sat together in the quiet room, and he understood that whatever had happened that afternoon, she had handled it in her own way, and on her own terms, and that was as it should be. He would learn, over time, in the pieces she chose to share with him, some of what had been said. Francis had come in and sat down and accepted tea and had looked around the house in a different way than she usually looked at it. Not the inspecting look, but a different one, more tentative. She had said, after a few minutes of careful conversation, that she owed Nadia an apology. She had said it precisely. "I owe you an apology." Not, "I'm sorry if I made you feel," which was the kind of apology that attaches conditions to itself. Just, "I owe you one." Nadia had received this without performance. She had not cried. She had not told Francis it was all right, because she was not in the habit of saying things were all right when they were more complicated than that. She had said, "Thank you for saying that." She had meant it. Francis had said some other things, about the position she had been in, about the decisions she had made, about how she had understood them at the time, and how she understood them differently now. Nadia had listened. She had asked one question, whether Francis had actually believed that Nadia had married Damien for his money. Francis had been quiet for a long moment. Then she had said, "No, I don't think I actually believe that. I think I found it useful to suggest it." Nadia had looked at her steadily and nodded once, and something in that exchange had settled a question that had been open between them since the wedding. They had drunk their tea. Francis had left after about an hour. She had said, at the door, "He's a better man for knowing you." Nadia had not responded to that. She had said goodbye, and she had meant it to be a beginning of something, though what exactly she was not sure, and she was comfortable not being sure, because she had stopped needing to know how things were going to go in advance. That had been one of the changes the past months had made in her. Winter arrived and the year turned, and the marriage turned with it. The turning was not the kind that is dramatic or sudden. It was the other kind. Gradual, accumulated, built from small consistent things. From mornings when Damien made breakfast before Nadia woke up, not because she would otherwise be late, but because he wanted to. From evenings when she came home from a shift, and he asked about her day, and actually wanted to know the answer, not as information management, but as genuine curiosity about the person he had chosen. From a Saturday in January, when they sat down together and went through the household accounts as equals, both of them looking at the same screen, both of them contributing to the decisions, neither of them deferred to by default. From a conversation, in March, when Nadia brought up something she had been thinking about for a while. She had been considering whether to apply for a senior position at the hospital, a role that would be more demanding, with leadership responsibilities, more hours in some periods. She brought it to him as a real conversation, not as an announcement of a decision already made, and not as a request for permission. She brought it as something she wanted to think through, with someone who mattered to her, and she offered it to him that way, as a partner, as someone whose perspective she wanted, not whose approval she required. He had listened, and asked the kind of questions that showed he was actually thinking about the situation, rather than performing interest. He had asked what attracted her to the role. He had asked what parts of it she had reservations about. He had asked what would need to change in the household to make it work if she took it, and he had offered things he was willing to take on differently to create that space, not as a sacrifice but as a practical arrangement between two people who understood that both of their professional lives mattered equally. She had applied for the role. She had been offered it 2 months later. He had been the second person she called, after the colleague who had encouraged her to apply, and when she heard his voice on the phone, clear and genuine, and full of a pride that had nothing in it of the old superiority. Not pride that reflected well on him, but pride in her. She had stood in the hospital car park in the spring sunshine and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for a very long time. She took the role. It was demanding, and it suited her. The month she started, a small family gathering was held at Roland's house. Roland had a birthday each year that he treated as a significant occasion, and the family had gathered around this tradition for as long as Damien could remember. Cousins, aunts, the people who formed the outer ring of the Osei family's social world. The food was always good, and the conversation was always full of the things that family gatherings are full of: catching up, small histories, gentle comparisons, the competitive warmth of people who know each other very well and love each other imperfectly. Frances was there. She and Nadia had exchanged a few more phone calls in the months since the Saturday afternoon tea, and the relationship between them was not warm, not yet, but it was honest, which was more than it had been, and both of them were managing it with a care that showed they both wanted it to be something real eventually. Roland, who had not been kept fully informed of everything that had happened, Damien had not shared the detail widely, only where it was necessary, found Nadia near the food table at one point in the evening, and said what he often said, which was something about how well she had fitted into the family, how steady she was, how Damien had chosen well. He meant it as a compliment. It was the kind of compliment she had been receiving in various forms since the wedding, and she had learned to receive it with a polite thank you, and move on. But then Roland said something he did not intend to say as an unkind thing, because Roland was not an unkind man, though he was not a careful one. He said, "You know, I think a lot of women in your position, coming into a family with less, would have made more demands of it, and you never have. That speaks well of you." He said it warmly. He said it as the highest praise he knew how to offer. Across the room, Damien heard it. He was standing in a conversation with two cousins about something unrelated, and he heard Roland's voice and turned his head slightly and heard the sentence, the full sentence, and he saw Nadia's face in the moment she received it. He saw the small, practiced smile, the polite nod, the beginning of the thank you she was about to give. He crossed the room. He came to stand beside Nadia, and he put his hand on her arm, briefly, a light touch, and Roland looked at him with the cheerful expectation of a man who assumes he is about to be agreed with. Damien said, "Actually, Roland, I want to correct something in that." Roland blinked. Nadia didn't come into this family with less," Damien said. He kept his voice entirely ordinary, not loud, not pointed, not performing for the room, just factual. "That's a misunderstanding that I've heard a few times, and I'd like it to be corrected. She came into this family having paid for her mother's medical care, alone, for years, while building a career and building a home. She came with more discipline and more capability than most people I know, including myself." Roland was looking at him with an expression that had stopped being cheerful and was now attempting to understand what was happening. "What I mean," Damien continued, "is that she is not someone who arrived needing to be accommodated. She is someone who has been accommodating a great deal, quietly, and she deserves to be seen accurately." The small part of the room that had been within hearing distance was quiet in the way that rooms become quiet when something unexpected has been said, not dramatically, not with gasps, but with a sudden quality of attention. Roland said, "Well, of course. Of course, I didn't mean—" "I know," Damien said. "It wasn't a cruel thing to say. It was just an inaccurate one." He said it the way he said things in professional settings, when he was clarifying a factual error, without malice, but without softening it into something comfortable. He turned to Nadia. She was looking at him with an expression he recognized. It was the expression he had finally understood, the one of complete, clear presence. Not surprise, not performance. She was simply looking at him and seeing him. He said, quietly, just to her, "You didn't need me to do that." "No," she said. "But I wanted to." "I know," she said. Frances, who had been standing nearby and had heard everything, said nothing. She looked at Nadia for a moment, and the look she gave her was not the look of a woman conducting an inspection or managing a room. It was something simpler. She held the look for a moment, and then turned back to the person she had been speaking with, and the gathering moved on, and plates were filled again, and conversations resumed, and the evening continued in the ordinary way. But something had been said in that room that had not been said before. And once a thing has been said in a room full of family, it does not unsay itself. It exists in the record. It lives in the way that family members retell things to each other, the way that gatherings become stories that get carried forward. What Damien had said was now part of how this family's history would be narrated, and he had said it plainly and without ceremony, and it was true, and that was what mattered. On the drive home, Nadia was quiet for the first few minutes. Then she said, "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," he said again. "I know." She looked out the window at the passing streets. "It's strange," she said, "to have someone else say the thing. I've been carrying the truth of it for so long on my own, that having someone else say it out loud felt—" "What?" "Strange," she said again. "Good. A bit startling, like hearing a song you know played in a different key." He thought about that. He said, "I should have been saying it for 4 years." She turned from the window to look at him. "You're saying it now." He nodded. They drove the rest of the way in a quiet that was simply the quiet of two people who had nothing left to perform for each other, which is one of the best kinds of quiet a marriage can contain. The house was dark when they arrived home. He unlocked the door, and they went in, and she put the kettle on, and he hung his jacket, and they moved through their house in the easy, practiced way of people who know a space and know each other inside it. The kitchen was warm when the kettle boiled. She made 2 cups without asking, and brought his to him, where he was sitting at the kitchen table. He looked at the cup. He thought about the grocery budget, and the envelopes, and the 3 years she had managed something alone that she should have been able to share. He thought about the woman who had walked up the aisle with market flowers, and the woman who had sat across this table and told him everything, and the woman who had just stood in Roland's kitchen and begun to give him a polite thank you for being insulted. He thought about all the versions of her he had been slow to see clearly. She sat down across from him with her own cup. He said, "I have been thinking about what I want to say to you, and I can't find the right words for most of it." She waited. "I know that sounds strange from me," he said. "I am usually better at words than this." "You are usually better at words when you're explaining something you already understand," she said. "This is different." "Yes," he said, "this is different." He looked at her across the kitchen table, in the warm light of the kitchen in their house, and he said, "I'm sorry. For the 4 years I spent inside a story about this marriage that made me the most important character in it. I'm sorry. For every time my mother said something and I didn't push back. I'm sorry for what I said about people and money, because you were in the room and I was telling you something about yourself and I didn't know it." He paused. "And I'm sorry I wasn't someone you could tell the truth to, from the beginning. That's the one I'll be working on for a long time." Nadia held her cup in both hands. She looked at him with the clear, steady, fully present look that he had needed 4 years to understand. "I know," she said. "Is that enough?" he said. She thought about it. "It's the beginning," she said. "Which is the right answer. Not yes. It's enough, and everything is settled. The beginning." He nodded. "I am also sorry," she said, "for the years of silence. For deciding for you what you would think. For the grocery account, I know that was a thin line and I drew it in the wrong place, for all of it." "I know," he said. They sat for a while in the warm kitchen. Outside, the night was deep and still. The house held them the way a house holds people who have decided to stay. Not perfectly, not without complexity, but firmly, with the particular stubbornness of things that have been through a great deal and are still standing. He thought about his father, Charles, who had built his life one careful brick at a time. He thought about the things that care looks like when it gets rigid. He thought about what he wanted to build, going forward, and how he wanted to build it, and with whom, and what kind of man he wanted to be inside the building. He thought that his father had been a good man. He thought he could also be a good man, which required him to understand that good men make mistakes, and the measure of them is not the absence of mistakes, but the honest accounting of them, the willingness to look at what they have done, and see it clearly, and to change, and to not require praise for the changing. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, where it rested on the cup. She turned her hand over, so that their palms were together. Outside, the city went about its nighttime business. Indifferent, consistent, entirely uninterested, in the small kitchen, where two people had decided to look at each other honestly, and keep going. The world does not witness most of the important moments in a marriage. They happen quietly, in ordinary rooms, between two people who are the only audience for the things that matter most. She brought nothing, they had said. She had always been the one carrying everything. She had carried it without complaint, without credit, without anyone who knew. She had carried it through a wedding, and a honeymoon, and 4 years of a life that required her to manage more than anyone in that life understood. She had carried it with the particular strength of a person who has decided that the carrying is simply what needs to be done, and who does not wait to be thanked for doing it. And she had put it down, finally, in a kitchen, on a Saturday morning, across a table from the man she had married, and told him the truth, and waited to see what he would do with it. He had done something with it. He was still doing something with it. He would be doing something with it for a long time. The cup of tea went cold. Neither of them moved to warm it up. The kitchen was quiet and warm, and the light above the table was steady, and the house was still around them. And they sat there holding hands across the table in the ordinary, extraordinary way of people who have finally arrived at the place they were always trying to reach, which is simply the truth of each other, plain and clear, and requiring nothing more than the courage to keep looking. That was all. That was, in the end, everything.